My name is Nicole Nichols, and I am 32 years old. A year ago, I drove to my parents' house in Savannah for what they called a routine family meeting. When I sat down in their sunroom, my father slid a legal document across the glass table. I scanned the estate trust once, twice, then looked up at them with a hollow chest. "My name is not here," I said. My father crossed his arms and sighed. "You really thought we would complicate things for your brother." So I left quietly. I placed a simple manila folder on the edge of the table before walking out the door. Months later, when the estate lawyer read what was inside that folder to the entire family, my parents' celebration turned to dead silence. They have not stopped calling since, but I never answered. Before I tell you what was in that folder, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Zara Told Stories, but only if you genuinely enjoy this story. Drop a comment telling me your age, where you are watching from, and what time it is there. Now let me take you back to that stifling August afternoon where the real betrayal began. August in Georgia does not just sit on your skin, it breathes on you. The humidity outside was heavy enough to drown in, but inside my parents' climate-controlled sunroom, the air felt brittle and cold. I sat across the patio table from David and Patricia Nichols, my parents. My mother held a tall crystal glass of iced sweet tea. The silver spoon in her hand moved in slow, methodical circles. The ice cubes clinked against the glass, a sharp, rhythmic sound that echoed in the quiet room. She kept her eyes focused on the swirling amber liquid, watching the sugar dissolve. Condensation beaded on the outside of her glass, sliding down to pool on the floral coaster. She did not look at me. David adjusted the collar of his crisp white golf polo. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, adopting the tone he used when negotiating contractor disputes. "We are revising the trust, Nicole," he said. "We are leaving the estate to Brandon." Just like that. A short conversation to erase 32 years of my existence. I am a global logistics manager. My daily life revolves around calculating variables, mitigating supply chain failures, and moving thousands of shipping containers across oceans. My brain is wired to process data and routes. Right now, the data was glaring. My brother Brandon was 34 years old. He had not attended a family dinner without asking for a check in a decade. When he was 25, he opened a boutique restaurant that folded in 8 months. My parents remortgaged their house to pay off his vendors. When he was 30, he bought a fleet of vehicles for a luxury rental business that went under because he forgot to secure commercial insurance. My parents drained their savings to settle the lawsuits. Every time Brandon fell, David and Patricia were there with a financial safety net. Every time I succeeded, earned a promotion, or bought my own home, I received a polite nod and a quick change of subject. I was the one who remembered their anniversaries. I organized their hurricane evacuation plans. I showed up. But he was the son, the entrepreneur, the golden child Brandon has overhead. My father continued gesturing vaguely with his hand. "He has payroll, investors. You have a stable corporate salary. You do well for yourself at the port. Splitting the assets would only tie up capital your brother needs to scale his ventures. We decided to keep things simple." Simple. The word hung in the cold air. I looked at my mother. The spoon finally stopped moving. She lifted the glass, taking a slow sip, her expression placid and untroubled. She set the drink down and smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her linen trousers. Empathy requires effort, and Patricia preferred comfort. I felt the familiar, heavy anchor of my childhood conditioning pulling at my throat. For as long as I could remember, my role in this family was defined by my lack of demands. Be the easy child. Take the hit. Do not cause a scene. I swallowed the sharp, jagged protest clawing up my windpipe. The instinct to argue, to demand a reason why my loyalty meant nothing, burned in my chest. But looking at their blank faces, I realized any argument would be treated as an emotional outburst. They had already rewritten the narrative. In their minds, they were making a practical business decision. In reality, they were funding Brandon's delusions at my expense. I nodded, once a brief mechanical dip of my chin. Understood, I said. My voice betrayed nothing. My father looked relieved, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. We knew you would see the logic, Nicole. You always have a good head on your shoulders. Not like your brother. He needs us to look out for him. He framed it as a compliment, a testament to my independence. It was a convenient way to dress up their neglect. I pushed my chair back. The metal legs scraped harshly against the terracotta tile, the sound cutting through my father's self-congratulatory relief. I did not wait for them to offer a hollow apology. I did not stick around for the inevitable pivot where my mother would ask if I could review Brandon's new shipping contracts for free. I walked out the front door, stepping out of the air conditioning and into the oppressive afternoon heat. Their manicured lawn stretched out in perfect, vibrant green squares. It was a flawless illusion of a healthy foundation, much like our family tree. I climbed into my sedan and gripped the leather steering wheel. The engine roared to life, and I blasted the air conditioning to dry the sudden sting in my eyes. I refused to cry in their driveway. I shifted the car into drive and headed toward the port of Savannah. The scenery outside my window shifted rapidly, from pristine suburban oaks to towering steel cranes and rusted cargo ships. The air lost its scent of cut grass, replaced by the harsh smells of diesel fuel, salt water, and exhaust. The port was loud, demanding, and real. Everything my family was not. I pulled into the employee lot of the logistics warehouse. Row after row of shipping containers were stacked like colorful building blocks against the gray sky. Semi-trucks rumbled past, shaking the asphalt beneath my feet as I walked toward the main office. I swiped my badge, the electronic beep grounding me in my professional reality. Inside, phones rang and coordinators shouted tracking numbers across cubicles. I walked to my desk, set my bag down, and woke up my monitors. Spreadsheets and freight manifests flooded the screens. I dove into the numbers. I tracked a delayed shipment from Rotterdam. I rerouted a freight train through Chicago. I focused on fixing broken chains halfway across the world because the chain connecting me to my own family had just snapped, and there was no logistical fix for that. The afternoon wore on, marked by the steady click of my keyboard and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. I drank stale breakroom coffee, letting the bitter taste snap my focus back to cargo weights and customs declarations whenever my mind tried to drift back to that sunroom. I spent the next 6 hours buried in logistics, pretending the morning had not happened. I told myself that the money did not matter. I told myself I was better off cutting the cord and living on my own terms. My independence was earned, not handed to me on a silver platter. I thought that was the end of the transaction. I assumed they had made their choice and would leave me alone to live my life. I packed my briefcase as the sun began to set, painting the industrial cranes in shades of orange and bruised purple. I was ready to go home to my quiet apartment and leave the Nichols family drama behind me forever. I had no idea the real ledger was just about to open, and Brandon was already looking for his next handout. The evening sun hung low over the Savannah port, casting long, bruised shadows across the asphalt. I walked out of the dispatch office with a clipboard under my arm, my steel-toed boots scraping against the gritty pavement. The air smelled of diesel exhaust, hot tar, and the salty tang of the nearby ocean. My shift was over, and my body carried the familiar ache of a 12-hour day spent rerouting delayed cargo ships and managing warehouse logistics. I headed toward my 5-year-old sedan, desperate for a quiet drive home. A vehicle blocked my parking space. It was a brand new black Range Rover, sleek and polished to a mirror finish. The engine idled with a soft, expensive hum. I stopped and stared at the tires. They were glossy, dressed with heavy silicone, without a single speck of dirt or dust on the treads. Those pristine tires sat inches away from a towering wall of rusted, salt-stained shipping containers that had crossed 3 oceans. The contrast was absurd. The truck did not belong here, and neither did the man stepping out of the driver's side door. Brandon wore a tailored navy blazer over a crisp white shirt, the top 2 buttons undone to display a manufactured sense of casual confidence. His hair was styled with precision, untouched by the coastal humidity. He stepped carefully around a small iridescent puddle of engine oil, grimacing as if the working world might infect his Italian leather loafers. He looked like a man who spent his days attending networking lunches and talking about synergy. He did not look like a man who had ever lifted a box loaded a truck or earned a single dollar through his own sweat. "Nikki," he called out, flashing a bright, rehearsed smile. "You look exhausted." "It is an industrial shipping port, Brandon," I said, keeping my distance. "We work for a living here. What do you want?" He chuckled, ignoring my tone, and leaned against the gleaming hood of his leased SUV. "I just wanted to check on my little sister. Mom said you rushed out of the house today. You know they only restructured the trust to protect the family assets. It was nothing personal." I tightened my grip on my clipboard. My parents disinheriting me to fund his perpetual failures was the definition of personal, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me bleed. I stared at him, waiting. Brandon never went out of his way for anyone unless he needed a favor. He cleared his throat, sensing my silence was not an invitation for small talk. He reached into the pristine leather portfolio resting on the hood of his truck and pulled out a stack of stapled papers. "Actually, I have a massive opportunity for you," he said, his voice dropping into the pitch cadence he used on naive investors. "My new real estate startup is on the verge of acquiring a prime commercial lot downtown. It is a gold mine. The zoning is perfect. I just need a bridge loan to close the deal by Friday, and I want to give you the chance to get in on the ground floor." He held the papers out. I did not take them. I let my eyes trace the bold print on the top page. It was a commercial loan application from a secondary lender known for predatory lending. "You want me to co-sign a loan?" I said, my voice flat. "Just as a guarantor," he corrected quickly, waving his hand as if swatting away a minor annoyance. "My credit took a temporary hit after the luxury car rental business folded. You know how the market fluctuates. But you have a spotless credit score. You have that steady corporate paycheck. All you have to do is sign on the dotted line and my firm gets the capital." I looked at the interest rate printed halfway down the page. It was staggering. If his supposed real estate venture defaulted, which his ventures always did, I would be on the hook for a debt that would bankrupt me within a year. "You were just named the sole heir to the entire family estate this afternoon," I said, measuring every word. "You have the trust. Go to a real bank." Brandon shifted his weight, his rehearsed smile faltering. "That wealth is tied up in property and mutual funds. It is paper wealth, Nikki. I need liquid cash right now to secure this lot. Mom and Dad secured the long-term legacy for me, which means I am the face of this family going forward. I have the legacy to uphold. I cannot be bogged down by short-term liquidity issues. You just clock in and out down here. You do not have the same pressures. You can handle the grunt work of securing this line of credit. It is your duty to pitch in." The sheer audacity of his logic settled over me like a heavy blanket. Less than 6 hours ago, our parents had stripped me of my rightful inheritance to ensure Brandon never had to struggle. Now he was standing in my workplace, demanding I risk my own hard-earned financial stability to fund his delusions. He truly believed that because he had been crowned the golden child, I existed solely to absorb his risks. He expected me to handle the grunt work of funding his lifestyle while he paraded around town playing the role of a successful CEO. For 32 years, I would have debated him. I would have tried to explain the math, pointing out the terrible interest rate and the flaws in his business model. I would have managed his feelings while sacrificing my own peace of mind. Not today. No, I said. Brandon blinked. He leaned forward, sure he had misheard me over the distant rumble of a freight train. Excuse me? I said, "No, Brandon. I will not sign your loan. I will not underwrite your failing startup. You have the family legacy to uphold. Figure it out yourself." His face flushed a dark red, the charming facade cracking to reveal the petulant, entitled child underneath. "You are being ridiculous, Nicole. Mom and Dad told me you might throw a tantrum about the trust, but I thought you were more mature than this. You are trying to sabotage my business because you are jealous." "I am not jealous," I replied, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "I am tired. I am tired of watching you play pretend while other people pay your admission fee. Do not come to my workplace again." I turned my back on him and walked toward my car. "You are going to regret this," he shouted, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal walls of the warehouse. "When this company goes public, do not come begging me for a handout." I unlocked my sedan, slid into the driver's seat, and shut the door, cutting off his tantrum. I watched through the rearview mirror as he snatched the loan documents off the hood, crumpled them in his fist, and stormed into his pristine SUV. He reversed recklessly, his tires finally picking up a layer of port dust, and sped out of the lot. I sat in the quiet cabin of my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had done it. I had set a boundary. I had looked my entitled brother in the eye and refused to be his stepping stone. A strange, unfamiliar sense of empowerment washed over me, mixing with the lingering adrenaline of the confrontation. I took a deep, shuddering breath, ready to drive home and finally process the chaotic events of the day. Then my cell phone rang. The sudden noise shattered the silence in my car. I pulled the phone from my cup holder and checked the screen. The caller ID displayed a familiar name, Mr. Henderson. He was a retired school teacher who lived next door to my grandfather's rustic cabin up in the misty Blue Ridge Mountains over 4 hours away. My grandfather, Henry, was 82 years old. He valued his fierce independence above all else, choosing to live alone in the remote wilderness rather than move closer to the city. A call from his neighbor at this hour meant only one thing. I accepted the call and pressed the phone to my ear. "Mr. Henderson, is everything all right, Nicole?" the older man said, his voice breathless and frantic. "You need to come up to the mountain, right away. It is Henry. I found him on the porch. He collapsed. The ambulance is taking him down to the county hospital now. You need to hurry." The highway stretched out before me as a ribbon of black asphalt cutting through the Georgia night. I drove north, leaving the suffocating humidity of the coast behind. The elevation climbed steadily, and the air filtering through my vents turned crisp and sharp. I navigated the winding, mist-shrouded roads of the Blue Ridge Mountains with my hazard lights flashing through the dense fog. Every sharp turn mirrored the twisting anxiety in my gut. My grandfather Henry was 82. He had spent his entire working life as a railroad engineer, building a life out of steel timber and sheer willpower. He was the only person in the Nichols family who ever saw me as a human being rather than a utility to be exploited. The thought of losing him tightened my grip on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned stark white. I reached the county hospital just after midnight. The building was a small, squat brick structure nestled in a quiet mountain valley. The sliding glass doors parted with a mechanical hiss. The emergency waiting area smelled of stale bleach and old coffee. I bypassed the empty reception desk and found a tired night shift nurse who pointed me toward a room at the far end of the hall. When I stepped inside, harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pale glow over the narrow bed. Henry looked small. For a man who had always seemed larger than life, seeing him tethered to an IV pole and cardiac monitors was a gut punch. His skin was pale, tracing the map of deep wrinkles earned from decades of sun and hard labor. He was awake, his chest rising and falling in shallow, measured breaths. I pulled a rigid plastic chair to his bedside and sat down. His eyes fluttered open. They were the same piercing blue they had always been, sharp, observant, and fiercely intelligent. "You drove too fast, Nicky," he rasped, offering a weak, crooked smile. "I can tell by the look on your face." "I told you to stop chopping your own firewood," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. I reached out and took his hand. His skin felt like old parchment, delicate but grounded. He ignored my scolding. Instead, he shifted his weight on the stiff hospital mattress. His trembling hands moved toward his chest. He was tightly clutching a silver pocket watch. It belonged to his late wife. The intricate floral engraving was worn smooth from years of his thumb rubbing across the metal. It was a silent symbol of his desperation to hold on to his history, his independence, and the life they had built together on that mountain. He refused to let it go, even in a sterile hospital bed. We sat in a comfortable, quiet understanding for hours. The monitors beeped in a steady, reassuring rhythm. The doctor came in to explain that it was a severe exhaustion episode combined with dehydration. He needed rest and supervision, but his heart was strong. I let out a long breath, thinking we had weathered the worst of the storm. Then the door swung open. David and Patricia walked in. They did not rush. They did not look panicked. My mother wore a pristine beige trench coat, and my father held a sleek leather briefcase. They looked like they were arriving at a corporate board meeting rather than a medical emergency. "How is he?" my father asked, stopping a safe distance from the bed. He kept his hands at his sides. He did not reach out to touch his own father. "He needs rest," I whispered, keeping my voice low so Henry could sleep. Patricia sighed, crossing her arms over her chest. She looked around the sterile room with open distaste. "This is exactly what we have been talking about, David. The mountain is too isolated." Henry opened his eyes, glaring at his son and daughter-in-law. "I am not dead yet, Patricia. You can lower your voice." My mother offered a tight, patronizing smile. "We are just being realistic, Henry. You had a fall. Next time, a neighbor might not find you in time." My father stepped forward, adopting his authoritative posture. "Dad, we need to have a serious conversation about your living situation. You have that sprawling, rustic mountain property. You also have those coastal marshland plots down south. It is too much to manage for a man your age. The maintenance alone is a liability." I stared at them, the gears in my logistical mind turning. They had driven 4 hours in the middle of the night, not to comfort a sick old man, but to execute a strategy. "What are you suggesting?" I asked, standing up to place myself between them and the bed. "We found a premier assisted living facility in Atlanta," Patricia said smoothly. "It is highly rated, sterile, safe, round-the-clock care. You will have a lovely room, Henry." Henry gripped his silver pocket watch tighter. His knuckles turned rigid. "I am not leaving my cabin. I built that house with my own 2 hands. Be reasonable, Dad, my father countered, his tone hardening into a demand. You cannot live there safely. If we transition you into the facility, we can consolidate your assets. Brandon has a new real estate venture. He can handle the liquidation of the mountain property and the marshlands. We will put the proceeds into a trust to cover your medical expenses, and Brandon can use the surplus capital to scale his business. It is a win for everyone. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. A cold, nauseating horror washed over me. Less than 24 hours ago, they had disinherited me to fund my brother. Less than 12 hours ago, Brandon had tried to force me into crippling debt for his startup. Now, they were targeting their own father. They were trying to strip a vulnerable elder of his autonomy, force him into a sterile nursing home, and liquidate his lifelong assets to subsidize the golden child. It was not care. It was predatory greed disguised as familial concern. I need to pause right here. Have you ever watched toxic relatives circle a vulnerable family member like vultures? Have you ever had to step in and protect an elder from people who view their life savings as a personal piggy bank? If you have been forced to be the shield for someone who could no longer fight for themselves, tell me in the comments. It is a terrifying, lonely position to be in, and it forces you to see your family for who they truly are. I looked back at Henry. The fierce independence in his eyes was battling a sudden quiet terror. He knew exactly what they were trying to do. Once they got him into a facility and took power of attorney, he would never see his home again. He would become a prisoner to their financial ambitions. He is not going to a nursing home, I said. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a blade. Patricia scoffed, waving a manicured hand. Nicole, stay out of this. You do not understand the legal complexities. I understand math, I shot back, stepping closer to them. I understand that Brandon is bleeding money, and you are trying to steal your own father's property to bail him out. David pointed a rigid finger at me. Watch your tone, young lady. We are acting in his best interest. You are acting in Brandon's best interest, I replied, my voice remarkably steady. You always do. But you are not touching his land. You are not taking his home. My mother narrowed her eyes, dropping the polite facade. Her expression turned cold and sharp. And who is going to stop us? You. You work 60 hours a week at a shipping port. You have no spouse, no family of your own, and no time. Who is going to provide his round-the-clock care, Nicole? If he goes back to that cabin, the state will declare him unfit to live alone. We have the legal high ground. The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She was right about the logistics. I had a demanding high-pressure career. I lived 4 hours away. I could not be in 2 places at once. If Henry could not prove he had a dedicated caretaker, my parents could easily petition the court for conservatorship. They would seize control of everything, sell his land to the highest bidder, and hand the check to my brother. I turned to look at my grandfather. He was watching me, his breathing shallow, his thumb tracing the worn silver of the pocket watch. He looked defeated, as if he was preparing to surrender his dignity to save me the burden of a fight. A profound, clarifying rage ignited in my chest. For my entire life, I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace. I had accepted their neglect. I had walked away from the family trust without a scream. I had allowed them to treat me like an invisible, reliable machine. But I would not let them do it to him. I looked my father dead in the eye. I felt the final frayed thread of my childhood submission snap. He is not going to a facility. I stated my words carrying the heavy, immovable weight of a vow. He is going home. I will be his primary caregiver. Patricia laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that echoed off the tile walls. You are going to throw away your career to be a nursemaid. Do not be dramatic, Nicole. You cannot handle it. Watch me, I said. My parents stared at me, shocked by the defiance they had never seen from me before. The battle lines were officially drawn. I had just declared war on my own family, and the logistics of my entire life were about to change. I just had to figure out how to survive the fallout, and I had no idea what my grandfather was secretly planning behind closed doors. 72 hours after the standoff in the county hospital, I sat in a sterile legal office in downtown Savannah. The tip of my pen hovered over a stack of documents. My signature on the medical proxy and durable power of attorney forms landed with a heavy finality. My logistical brain had mapped out the threat the moment my parents demanded Henry be placed in a facility. They had already contacted their own attorneys to draft a conservatorship petition, intending to cite his collapse as proof of his incompetence. I beat them by 3 days. Filing those papers drew a profound, uncrossable battle line in the sand. I was no longer just a reliable, quiet daughter. I was the enemy. The transition was brutal. I broke the lease on my Savannah apartment, packed my entire independent life into cardboard boxes, and drove my sedan back up the winding roads to the Blue Ridge Mountains. I moved into the spare bedroom of my grandfather's rustic cabin. The space was small, drafty, and miles away from the fast-paced corporate world I had spent a decade conquering. My daily routine transformed overnight into a grueling dual existence. My logistics company allowed me to work remotely, but the demands of the global supply chain did not pause for family emergencies. I transformed Henry's antique oak dining table into a makeshift command center. 2 sleek monitors sat next to a plastic daily pill organizer. I spent my mornings tracking delayed freighters across the Atlantic and negotiating tariffs with European vendors, all while keeping a watchful eye on my grandfather. The physical toll was staggering. Caregiving is a raw, unglamorous reality that television movies rarely depict honestly. It meant waking up at 3 a.m. to help a proud, stubborn man navigate the short walk to the bathroom. It meant measuring blood pressure, adjusting oxygen tubes, and pureeing food when his throat was too sore to swallow. I functioned on 4 hours of sleep and endless cups of bitter black coffee. My shoulders ached from supporting his weight, and my eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets. David and Patricia retaliated against my interference with swift, calculated silence. They cut me off entirely. They removed me from the shared family emergency contacts. They canceled the joint streaming accounts I had paid for over the last 5 years. It was a petty, childish freeze-out designed to starve me of affection and force a surrender. They assumed the isolation would break my resolve. They believed I would eventually crack under the pressure, abandon Henry, and return to Savannah begging for their approval. Brandon took a different approach. He did not use silence. He used venom. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, my phone buzzed on the wooden table. I was in the middle of routing a critical shipment of agricultural supplies around a port strike. I answered the call without checking the caller ID. "I hope you are enjoying your new life," Brandon said. His voice dripped with arrogant disdain. I kept my eyes on my computer screen, typing a rapid response to a client. "What do you want, Brandon?" "I want to congratulate you on throwing away your career to wipe a stubborn old man's face," he sneered. "You torpedoed my real estate funding. Mom and Dad were going to secure that bridge loan using the mountain property as collateral, but your little legal stunt froze the assets. You are ruining the family legacy because you want to play the hero. You are just a glorified nurse now, Nicole." He waited for a reaction. He wanted me to scream, to defend my choices to engage in the toxic dance we had been performing since childhood. Instead, I pressed the red button on the screen and disconnected the call. I blocked his number. I did not have the energy to entertain his delusions. The exhaustion was bone deep. There were afternoons when the weight of 2 full-time jobs threatened to pull me under. During those heavy moments, I found an unexpected source of strength in the environment around me. Henry kept a large hand-carved wooden bowl filled with dried driftwood. He had collected the pieces from his coastal marshland plots over the decades. The air inside the cabin carried the permanent, soothing scent of old pine from the mountain forests, mixed with the faint, crisp memory of sea salt. It was an impossible, comforting combination. Breathing in that scent grounded me. It reminded me of the rugged, enduring history of the man I was fighting to protect. The true solace came during the late-night hours. When the global shipping markets quieted down and the mountain winds howled outside the cabin windows, Henry and I would sit by the stone fireplace. The family believed his mind was failing. They thought his physical collapse signaled a mental decline. They were entirely wrong. Henry was sharper than ever. He watched me juggle conference calls and medication schedules with quiet intensity. "You have a good head for rooting things, Nikki," he said one night, staring into the flickering orange flames. "You see all the moving parts. You know how to get the cargo from point A to point B without losing the freight." I smiled, pulling a thick woven blanket over his lap. "I have had a lot of practice cleaning up messes, Grandpa." He turned his piercing blue eyes toward me. His gaze was remarkably clear. "Some messes are not meant to be cleaned up," he whispered. "Some structures just need to be torn down so you can build something stronger on the foundation." I frowned, sensing a hidden weight in his words. "What does that mean?" He just patted my hand, offering a cryptic smile. "It means you are doing a good job, kid. Just keep tracking the shipments." His physical recovery progressed slowly, but his secretive energy increased. He spent hours writing in a leather-bound notebook when he thought I was not looking. He made hushed phone calls from the landline in the kitchen while I was outside chopping firewood. I talked it up to the eccentricities of an old man trying to maintain control over his shrinking world. I was too consumed by my own exhaustion to investigate his quiet activities. That ignorance lasted until the first week of October. The autumn air had turned crisp, turning the mountain leaves into vibrant shades of gold and crimson. I walked down the long, unpaved driveway to check the rural mailbox. The metal door squeaked in protest as I pulled it open. Inside, resting on top of a stack of grocery circulars and utility bills, was a heavy envelope. It was made of thick, cream-colored parchment. The texture felt expensive against my calloused fingertips. I flipped it over. The return address was embossed in sharp, professional lettering. It did not belong to a local mountain doctor or utility company. It was the crest of a high-end, ruthless corporate law firm located in the financial district of downtown Atlanta. The letter was addressed directly to Henry. I stared at the pristine envelope, the cold mountain wind biting through my sweater. My logistics brain immediately started calculating the variables. A rural, retired railroad engineer living in a rustic cabin had no business with a powerhouse estate firm in the city. My parents had hired local attorneys to draft their failed conservatorship petition. This was something else entirely. This was a sophisticated, expensive maneuver, and it was happening right under my roof. I tucked the envelope under my arm and walked slowly back toward the cabin, the crunch of dry wheels echoing beneath my boots. The battle lines I had drawn to protect my grandfather were clear. But as I looked at the smoke rising from the stone chimney, I realized Henry was secretly drawing battle lines of his own. The autumn chill crept through the gaps in the cabin floorboards, signaling a shift in the season. I stood in the kitchen, nursing a mug of bitter coffee, my mind still wrestling with the heavy parchment envelope I had handed Henry the day before. He claimed the letter from the elite Atlanta firm was merely pension paperwork. My supply chain experience taught me to recognize hidden variables, and that envelope carried the distinct weight of a concealed strategy. Before I could interrogate him further, my cell phone vibrated against the wooden counter. It buzzed once, then twice. Then a relentless, continuous stream of chimes filled the quiet room. I picked up the device. My stomach tightened into a rigid knot. These notifications did not originate from shipping clients or freight coordinators. They were text messages from extended relatives I had not spoken to in nearly half a decade. Uncle Paul, Cousin Stephanie, Aunt Carol. Their digital words flashed across my locked screen, forming a coordinated barrage of unearned judgment. How could you do this to your own parents? I watched Amanda post her video. You need professional help, Nicole. Stop using Henry to get revenge on your brother. I unlocked the device, a cold sense of dread pooling in my chest. I opened the social media application I rarely utilized. The algorithm required zero prompting. It immediately pushed the source of the manufactured outrage to the top of my feed. The content belonged to Amanda. Amanda was my brother's wife. She was a Caucasian woman in her late 20s who treated her existence as a highly curated performance. She possessed no tangible skills, but she understood the modern currency of digital victimhood. She built a modest online following by promoting beige home decor, performative wellness routines, and fabricated struggles. She knew exactly how to manipulate an audience, and she had just designated me as her latest villain. In the video, Amanda sat in the driver's seat of her leased luxury vehicle. She adjusted the lighting to catch the golden hour sun illuminating her perfectly styled, tousled hair. She wore minimal makeup intentionally, designed to project a raw, emotionally exhausted aesthetic. A solitary, heavily practiced tear slipped down her cheek as she stared mournfully into the lens. "Hey guys," Amanda whispered, her vocal fry trembling with rehearsed vulnerability. "I usually keep my page positive, but my family is enduring a really dark season right now. My husband is heartbroken. His sister has essentially kidnapped his sick grandfather." I stared at the glowing pixels, my pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "She is a very lonely, bitter person," Amanda continued, pressing a manicured hand to her chest. "She has no husband, no children, just a cold, corporate job. She isolated our grandfather in his rural cabin, preventing him from receiving the premier medical care my in-laws arranged. She is trying to steal the modest pennies he saved from his railroad days just because she resents my husband's entrepreneurial success. Please send prayers for our healing." I checked the metrics beneath the playing video. Thousands of views. Hundreds of comments poured in from strangers offering their misplaced sympathy, labeling me a desperate spinster and a greedy opportunist. Amanda had successfully weaponized my grueling, exhausting reality. She monetized my sacrifice to inflate her follower count. I need to ask you something right now. Have you ever experienced the unique horror of the modern smear campaign? Have you ever watched toxic relatives manipulate a public platform, painting themselves as wounded victims while you handle the grueling responsibilities behind closed doors? It is a terrifying, isolating strategy. They rely on the fact that an audience craves a villain, and they will gladly cast you in that role to hide their own neglect. If you have survived a digital character assassination orchestrated by your own blood trap, a 1 in the comments. You know exactly how suffocating that false narrative can feel. I locked the phone and tossed it onto the table. A sharp, stinging betrayal radiated through my nerves. It was one thing for my parents to cut my financial ties. It was another entirely for my sister-in-law to broadcast a fabricated reality to the globe, inciting a mob of extended relatives against me. The isolation struck immediately. Over the next 48 hours, the smear campaign expanded. Amanda posted daily updates. She shared filtered photographs of Brandon looking pensive, accompanied by lengthy captions detailing the profound pain of elder abuse. The extended family swallowed the narrative without a single question. My phone rang with voicemails from aunts demanding I step down and let David and Patricia manage the estate. They shamed me. They called me a parasite. They isolated me entirely, hoping the collective public pressure would force my surrender. The digital noise was deafening, but my physical reality required relentless precision. On Thursday morning, I stood at the kitchen counter preparing Henry's daily medication. The dawn light filtered through the cabin window, catching the dust motes dancing in the cold air. I laid out the plastic pill organizer. I picked up a sterile antiseptic wipe. The clinical sharp scent of rubbing alcohol cut through the comforting aroma of mountain pine. I reached into the small cooler bag and retrieved the glass vial of insulin. My phone sat on the counter inches away from the medical supplies. The screen displayed a jagged crack across the bottom right corner, a souvenir from a chaotic shift at the shipping port. A new notification illuminated the shattered glass. It was an image update from Amanda. The thumbnail showed a black and white photograph of Henry's empty leather chair at my parents' Savannah house. Plastered across the image in bold, aesthetic text was a specific, cruel phrase. #family burden. I stared at the glowing letters, shining through the broken glass. Family burden. That was how they labeled the man who built their entire foundation. That was how they viewed the daughter who surrendered her independent life to keep him safe. A potent, clarifying rage surged in my veins. The urge to defend my character roared in my ears. I wanted to create an account, initiate a live broadcast, and scream the truth into the digital void. I wanted to upload high-resolution screenshots of Brandon's predatory loan applications. I wanted to expose my parents' calculated plan to force Henry into a sterile facility. I wanted to drag their pristine, manufactured reputations through the mud for everyone to see. I picked up the cold insulin vial. The chilled glass grounded my fingertips. No. I drew a deep, steadying breath, forcing the logic center of my brain to override the emotional surge. Engaging in a public war meant supplying Amanda with more content, more engagement, and more unearned sympathy. If I fought back online, I validated her narrative. I would be playing a rigged game on her territory. I am a logistics manager. I do not deal in optics. I traffic in tangible, undeniable results. I muted the extended family group chat. I blocked Amanda across all platforms. I disabled my social media notifications entirely. The digital world faded into silence, leaving only the quiet, demanding reality of the mountain cabin. I focused my energy where it actually mattered. I applied my supply chain expertise to Henry's healthcare routine. I drafted color-coded spreadsheets for his doctor visits, mapped out optimal routes to the nearest pharmacy to minimize transit time, and negotiated bulk deliveries for his medical supplies to reduce overhead costs. I optimized his survival. I walked into the living room holding the prepared syringe and the antiseptic wipe. Henry sat in his favorite armchair, the silver pocket watch resting on his knee. He looked up at me, his piercing blue eyes studying my face. He had noticed my quiet intensity all week. He understood the family had turned their weapons toward me. "They are making a lot of noise down on the coast, are they not?" he asked softly. I knelt beside his chair, swiping the alcohol pad across his upper arm. "Just a lot of empty cargo, Grandpa. Nothing we cannot handle." I administered the shot with practiced precision. He did not flinch. He just watched me, a profound sense of pride radiating from his weathered face. "You know, Nikki," he said, adjusting his flannel sleeve. "A loud engine usually indicates a broken belt. The quiet machines are the ones handling all the heavy lifting. Let them make their noise. They have no idea what is coming down the track. I discarded the used wrapper into the small trash can. What do you mean by that? Henry offered that same cryptic, secretive smile he had worn when he hid the letter from the Atlanta law firm. He tapped the worn face of his pocket watch, his eyes sparkling with a hidden strategy. I am feeling much stronger today, he announced, shifting the subject entirely. In fact, I think I am strong enough to travel. I need you to clear your work schedule for next Tuesday. I frowned, running through his medical chart in my head. You do not have any local appointments scheduled for next week. I am not talking about the local mountain clinic, Henry said, leaning back in his chair. I need you to drive me into downtown Atlanta. I have a very specific routine appointment I need to attend, and I need you to wait in the lobby while I take care of some crucial business. I stared at him, the logistical variables spinning rapidly in my mind. Atlanta was a long drive. It was also the exact location of the elite corporate law firm whose crest was stamped on that thick cream envelope. My grandfather was plotting a counterstrike, and he was keeping me entirely in the dark. The gears of his hidden machinery were turning, and the collision course with my parents was rapidly approaching. Tuesday morning broke, with a heavy, damp fog gripping the Blue Ridge peaks. The drive down the mountain required total, unwavering concentration. The winding roads were slick with dew, and the sheer drop-offs demanded respect. Henry sat in the passenger seat of my sedan. He wore his Sunday best, a pressed charcoal suit hanging slightly loose on his shrinking frame, a polished silver tie clip, and his scuffed but well-oiled wingtip shoes. For a man claiming to visit a cardiovascular specialist, he looked prepared for a corporate board of directors meeting. The journey to Atlanta takes over 2 hours from the cabin. During that transit, my cell phone vibrated relentlessly in the center console. I was managing a critical rerouting protocol for a fleet of cargo ships backed up off the coast of Savannah. A severe weather front had stalled operations across the eastern seaboard, and my regional team needed executive approvals to divert the freight to alternative ports. I balanced a high-stakes corporate career from the driver's seat of a mid-sized sedan, acting as an unpaid chauffeur for a stubborn octogenarian. The dual existence frayed my nerves. My shoulders carried a familiar, rigid tension. We navigated the congested lanes of the interstate, the skyline of Atlanta rising like a fortress of glass and steel against the autumn sky. The towering structures reflected the morning light. Henry directed me, his voice calm and precise. He did not point me toward the medical district. He guided the car deep into the financial sector, where skyscrapers housed investment banks, hedge funds, and elite legal practices. We pulled into a subterranean parking garage beneath a towering modern structure. I parked the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel. This is not a clinic, Grandpa, I stated, studying the polished concrete walls and reserved executive parking spaces. He adjusted his tie, his posture straightening. I never said I was seeing a medical doctor, Nikki. I said I had a routine appointment. Routine, for me at least. We rode the express elevator up to the 42nd floor. The doors parted silently, revealing a sprawling reception area bathed in natural light. The space featured imported Italian marble floors, sleek mahogany desks, and panoramic windows offering a bird-eye view of the bustling city below. Behind the reception desk, brushed aluminum letters spelled out the name of the firm. It was a powerhouse of state and corporate litigation practice, known for handling the wealth of prominent Southern dynasties. Henry approached the receptionist, gave his name, and turned back to me. I need you to wait right here in the lobby, he instructed. My logistical mind calculated the risks. You brought me all the way to Atlanta just to sit on a couch. What are you doing, Henry? He leaned on his wooden cane. I am handling my business solo. Plausible deniability is a valuable asset, and you already have enough cargo on your shoulders. Sit down, do your port work, and wait for me. He walked through a set of frosted glass doors, leaving me alone in the opulent lobby. I sank into a plush leather sofa, pulled my laptop from my tote bag, and connected to the secure guest network. The next 2 hours were a blur of intense corporate triage. I fielded conference calls with harbor masters, authorized overtime pay for dock workers, and negotiated temporary storage fees for perishable goods. I muted my microphone every time a junior partner or a paralegal walked past my seating area. The contrast was jarring. I was a global supply chain manager, orchestrating international trade from a waiting room, while my grandfather secretly dismantled his own financial history down the hall. The physical strain of the dual roles weighed heavily on my spine. I was burning through my accrued vacation days. I was jeopardizing my quarterly performance bonuses. I risked the promotion I had spent 4 years earning. My parents believed I was merely a glorified nurse, failing to understand that I ran a maritime logistics hub via a cellular hotspot connection. Brandon thought I was a bitter spinster trying to steal a few pennies. They possessed no concept of the pressure cooker I inhabited daily. I typed out an email to the Customs Enforcement Agency, my eyes burning from the harsh glare of the screen. I needed sleep. I needed a break. But mostly, I needed to know what Henry was signing behind those frosted doors. The glass doors finally swung open. Henry emerged. His steps were slower than when he arrived, the adrenaline of the secret meeting clearly fading, but his eyes burned with an intense, satisfied clarity. He looked like a man who had just won a high-stakes poker game. Walking beside him was a tall, imposing man in a bespoke navy suit. This was Mr. Lawson. The attorney possessed an aura of quiet, ruthless authority. He moved with the precision of a predator accustomed to controlling the room. In his left hand, he carried a heavy, embossed leather briefcase. As they approached the waiting area, the rich, distinct scent of expensive leather polish and hidden power drifted across the marble floor. It was the scent of sealed fates, ironclad legal traps, and undeniable wealth. Mr. Lawson extended a firm hand toward me. "You must be Nicole," he said, his voice deep and measured. "Your grandfather speaks highly of your organizational skills. We have taken care of the necessary adjustments." I shook the lawyer's hand, my gaze darting briefly to the locked briefcase. "What kind of adjustments?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Henry placed a warm, weathered hand on my shoulder. "Just clearing the tracks, Nikki," he said, flashing a cryptic, knowing smile. "Ensuring the freight reaches the proper destination without any interference." Mr. Lawson offered a polite nod, revealing nothing. "Safe travels back to the mountains, Henry. We will retain all the original documents in our vault." We descended back to the subterranean parking garage in a heavy silence. I helped Henry into the passenger seat, buckling his seatbelt. He fell asleep before we even cleared the dense city limits, his breathing evening out into a soft rhythm. I navigated the busy highways merging into the northbound traffic. I drove back toward the Blue Ridge Mountains, the rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt providing a temporary illusion of peace. I did not know the specifics of what he had authorized in that boardroom. I did not know whose names were added or removed from his legacy. But I understood the mechanics of cause and effect. My parents treated Henry's assets like their personal treasury. They tracked his movements, waiting for an opportunity to strike. If David and Patricia caught wind of an unauthorized trip to an elite Atlanta law firm, their retaliation would be swift and unhinged. They would realize their control was slipping. They would panic. I turned onto the familiar rural highway leading up to the misty peaks, focusing on the road ahead. The autumn leaves blurred past the windows in streaks of gold and rust. I believed we had executed the secret mission flawlessly. I assumed we had slipped under the radar. I pulled the sedan up the long, winding dirt driveway of the cabin, eager to get Henry inside and back into his warm bed. I had no idea the quiet mountain sanctuary was already compromised. A screaming ambush was waiting for us on the front porch, and the fragile piece I had fought so hard to build was about to shatter into 1,000 pieces. The tires of my sedan crunched over the loose gravel of the driveway. I steered around the final bend, the familiar silhouette of the log cabin coming into view through the dense autumn canopy. My shoulders ached from the long drive, and I looked forward to settling Henry into his recliner with a warm cup of tea. That fragile hope evaporated the moment my headlights swept across the clearing. A pristine silver Lexus SUV was parked diagonally across the front lawn, its tires crushing a patch of wild mountain ferns. David and Patricia stood on the wooden porch. They looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of raw timber and fading daylight. My mother wore a structured wool coat and a silk scarf pulled tight around her neck to ward off the mountain chill. My father paced the length of the wooden deck, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his tailored slacks. They did not look like concerned family members arriving for a surprise visit. They looked like hostile auditors, ready to dismantle a rival firm. I shifted the car into park and turned off the ignition. Henry opened his eyes, taking in the scene through the windshield. His jaw tightened, the lines around his mouth deepening into a hard, unforgiving grimace. "Let me handle this," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You just focus on catching your breath." I stepped out of the vehicle, my boots hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. The cold air bit at my cheeks, but the adrenaline surging through my veins ran searing hot. "Where have you been?" my father demanded before I even reached the wooden steps. His voice echoed off the surrounding pine trees, sharp and accusatory. I walked around the front of the car, opening the passenger door for my grandfather. "We went for a drive," I replied, offering Henry my arm to help him stand. "It is a beautiful autumn day, David. We wanted to see the leaves turn." "Do not lie to me, Nicole," he snapped, stepping down off the porch to block our path to the door. "I received a notification from the corporate toll account. The transponder on your windshield registered on the downtown Atlanta Expressway 3 hours ago. You drove him into the financial district. What were you doing there?" My logistical mind cursed the oversight. In the chaos of breaking my lease and relocating my entire life, I had neglected to remove the automated toll pass tied to his company plan. It was a minor data leak, but it was enough to trigger their paranoia. "We were handling private business," Henry said. His voice was raspy, but it carried the undeniable authority of a patriarch. "Step aside, David. I am tired, and I want to sit in my own chair." Patricia scoffed, descending the stairs to stand beside her husband. "Private business? You mean she dragged you into the city to manipulate your finances? We know exactly what is happening here. She is isolating you up on this mountain, cutting you off from your real family, and draining the estate behind our backs." The accusation hung in the freezing air, absurd and venomous. I had drained my own savings to cover the specialized medical equipment the insurance refused to subsidize. I had sacrificed my sleep, my social life, and my career trajectory to keep him out of a sterile institution. I guided Henry past them, ignoring their posturing. "We are going inside," I stated. "The temperature is dropping and he needs to rest. You can follow us in, or you can get back in your car and drive down the mountain." They followed us inside. The interior of the cabin was dim, smelling of old wood smoke and dried lavender. I helped Henry into his worn leather recliner, draping a woven blanket over his lap. He closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths. The trip had drained his reserves. I turned around to face my parents, positioning myself between them and the chair. The transition from weary caregiver to defensive shield happened in a fraction of a second. "What did you make him sign?" Patricia demanded, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. She paced across the braided rug, her expensive heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "Did you have him change the deed to the marshlands? Did you try to steal Brandon's inheritance?" I crossed my arms, refusing to shrink under her glare. You are obsessed with an inheritance that does not belong to you. Brandon is 34 years old. He needs to earn his own living instead of waiting for a funeral. My father stepped forward, his face flushed dark red. You have no right to speak about your brother that way. He is building a legacy. You are just a bitter, resentful woman trying to punish us because we made a practical decision about the trust. You think you can swoop in here, play the devoted nurse, and steal what belongs to the family. You are brainwashing a sick old man. I looked at David, really looked at him, and realized I felt nothing but profound pity. He was terrified of losing control. He was terrified that his golden child would face the consequences of failure. He projected all of his own greed onto me because facing his own reflection was too painful. I did not brainwash anyone, I replied, keeping my tone deadly calm. I just showed up, something neither of you managed to do. Patricia let out a harsh, mocking laugh. Showed up. You are a parasite, Nicole. You latched onto him because you have nothing else in your pathetic life. You want his money to validate your own miserable existence. She threw her hands in the air, a theatrical gesture of disgust. As her arm swung backward, her wrist caught the edge of the antique wooden side table. A silver picture frame toppled over, sliding off the polished surface. It hit the floorboards with a sharp, heavy thud. The room went dead silent. I looked down. It was a photograph of Henry and his late wife, taken on the porch of this very cabin 40 years ago. The glass had not shattered, but the frame lay face down in the dust. My mother did not apologize. She did not even look at the object she had knocked over. She just stood there, breathing heavy, waiting for me to break down or start screaming. She wanted a dramatic, hysterical reaction to validate her narrative that I was unstable. I did not give her the satisfaction. I slowly knelt on the braided rug. I picked up the silver frame. A faint smudge of dirt marked the glass directly over my grandmother's smiling face. I pulled the sleeve of my sweater over my thumb and calmly, methodically, wiped the glass clean. I polished away the dirt until the image was crystal clear. I stood back up and gently placed the photograph exactly where it belonged on the table. The micro-tension in the room thickened into something suffocating. Then I turned back to the woman who gave birth to me. The subservient, quiet daughter who spent 3 decades swallowing insults died right there on that braided rug. I applied the ruthless efficiency of a logistics manager to my personal life. I identified the toxic variables, and I executed the protocol to remove them from my supply chain. You are leaving, I said. My voice did not shake. It held the quiet, dangerous calm of a rising tide. Excuse me, Patricia stammered, taken aback by the shift in my demeanor. I pointed a single finger toward the heavy wooden door. Get out of my house. You do not get to come into this sanctuary, disrespect the man who built it, and hurl insults at me. You do not get to treat us like collateral damage for your failing son. Your access to this property is revoked. Your access to me is terminated. Walk out that door right now, or I will call the county sheriff and have you trespassed. David puffed up his chest, trying to reclaim his fading authority. You cannot kick us out. This is my father's house. Actually, Henry wheezed from the recliner, opening one sharp blue eye to look at his son. She is the designated medical proxy and holds durable power of attorney. She decides who crosses the threshold for my health and safety, and right now, the two of you are a health hazard. Listen to the girl. Get out. The realization hit David and Patricia simultaneously. They had lost the tactical advantage. They had driven 4 hours hoping to intimidate a tired caregiver and a sick old man. Instead, they hit a titanium wall. Patricia opened her mouth to argue, but the cold, unyielding look in my eyes stopped the words in her throat. She recognized that the old Nicole was gone. My father grabbed his wife's elbow, his face a mask of humiliated fury. "This is not over, Nicole. When the dust settles, you will have nothing left." He pulled open the front door, the hinges groaning in protest, and dragged Patricia out into the freezing night. I stood in the center of the room, listening to the heavy footsteps march across the wooden deck. A moment later, the engine of the Lexus roared to life. The tires spun on the loose gravel, spraying dirt into the trees as they sped down the mountain road. I waited until the sound of their exhaust faded into the distance, swallowed entirely by the silent forest. I let out a long, shaky breath, the residual adrenaline trembling in my hands. I turned to look at my grandfather. He was leaning back in the leather chair, his chest heaving as he fought for oxygen. The confrontation had taken a severe physical toll on him, but a wide, brilliant smile stretched across his weathered face. "You handled that cargo like a true professional, Nikki," he whispered, his eyes shining with profound pride. I walked over to the kitchen to boil water for his tea, a deep, unfamiliar peace settling over my spirit. I had finally said no to my lifelong bullies. I had severed the emotional chains that bound me to their approval. The unannounced ambush had failed, but as I listened to Henry's labored breathing, a dark, heavy realization washed over me. The victory was sweet, but it was going to be brutally short-lived. And the hardest goodbye of my life was waiting just around the corner. 6 months vanished into a grueling blur of medical charts and fading winter snow. April arrived in the Blue Ridge Mountains, bringing a steady drumming rain instead of the usual vibrant spring blooms. Henry's decline was not a sudden crash. It was a slow, agonizing fade. The fierce independence that defined his 82 years surrendered to failing organs and fatigue. My makeshift logistics command center on the dining table was gradually replaced by hospice supplies, oxygen tanks, and stacks of unread mail. I took an extended leave of absence from the shipping port. My corporate ambitions shrank until they fit entirely inside the 4 walls of that rustic cabin. David, Patricia, and Brandon maintained their radio silence. They did not call to check on his condition. They did not visit to offer support. They simply waited in Savannah, hovering like patient vultures, assuming the mountain would eventually do the dirty work for them. Their absence was a blessing disguised as abandonment. It allowed my grandfather and me to spend those final months in unbroken peace. The physical toll of caregiving stripped away my remaining energy. I spent my mornings fighting with insurance representatives over the phone while sitting on the freezing wooden porch. I spent my afternoons administering pain medication and adjusting pillows to ease his bed sores. The unglamorous reality of family duty is rarely discussed in polite company. It is a lonely, exhausting marathon of bodily fluids, sleepless nights, and preemptive grief. Yet I did not regret a single second. I was giving the only man who ever saw my true value a dignified exit. It happened on a Tuesday night. A heavy storm rolled across the mountain peaks, wrapping the cabin in a thick curtain of gray mist. The rain fell in steady, rhythmic sheets, striking the corrugated tin roof with a dull, metallic drumming. The sound usually brought Henry a deep sense of comfort. He used to say the rain was nature washing away the dirt of yesterday. That night, the storm felt different. It felt like a countdown ticking toward 0. I sat in the wooden chair next to his bed, a dim yellow lamp casting long shadows across the handmade quilt. Henry looked incredibly fragile. a hollow shell of the robust railroad engineer who had built a life out of timber and steel. His breathing was shallow, a raspy struggle that tore at my chest. I held his right hand. His skin felt like delicate tissue paper, cold and translucent over his prominent veins. In his left hand, resting squarely on his chest, his fingers loosely curled around my grandmother's silver pocket watch. He had refused to let it out of his sight. A profound, suffocating sorrow threatened to swallow me whole. For 32 years, I had navigated a family dynamic built entirely on transaction and utility. My parents viewed me as an insurance policy. My brother viewed me as a limitless bank account. Henry was the sole person who offered me unconditional shelter from their greed. The realization that I was about to lose my only true ally terrified me. The mountain felt vast and empty, and I felt incredibly small. I fought to keep my tears in check. I swallowed the lump forming in my throat, forcing my expression to remain calm. I did not want his final memory of me to be one of panic. I needed to be the steady anchor he had always been for me. His eyes fluttered open. The sharp, piercing blue was cloudy now, veiled by the approaching end. He turned his head slightly toward me, squeezing my fingers with a fraction of his former strength. "Nikki," he whispered. His voice was barely a breath competing with the steady sound of the rain overhead. I leaned in closer, brushing a stray wisp of white hair from his forehead. "I am right here, Grandpa. I am not going anywhere." He swallowed hard, struggling to find the oxygen required to speak. "Listen to me," he rasped, his cloudy eyes searching my face. "The real shipment is coming in, Nikki. Do not let them touch the cargo." My brow furrowed. My logistical brain tried to process the statement, searching for a literal meaning. I thought the delirium had finally taken hold, confusing his ancient memories of the railroad with my modern maritime career. "The cargo," I repeated softly, hoping to soothe his wandering mind. He squeezed my hand again, a sudden desperate urgency flashing in his gaze. It was not delirium. It was a final instruction. "You track the freight," he whispered, his chest heaving with the effort. "You keep the manifest safe. They will try to hijack it. Promise me you will lock down the port." The image of that elite Atlanta law firm flashed in my memory. I remembered the heavy, embossed leather briefcase carried by Mr. Lawson. I remembered the cryptic smile on my grandfather's face when we left the subterranean parking garage. I did not understand the exact corporate terminology filtering through his final moments, but I understood the core message. He was telling me to stand my ground against the wolves waiting down on the coast. He had arranged something monumental, and he was passing the ledger to me. I squeezed his hand back, pressing my lips to his cold knuckles. "I promise, Grandpa. I will not let them touch a single crate. The cargo is secure." A faint, satisfied smile touched the corners of his mouth. The tension in his shoulders melted away, dissolving seamlessly into the mattress. His grip on my hand loosened. I watched his chest rise one last time. The rhythmic, slowing sound of the rain against the tin roof intensified, washing over the dim room and masking his final, quiet breath. The silence that followed within the cabin was absolute. The silver pocket watch slipped from his relaxing fingers, coming to rest against the folds of the patchwork quilt. He was gone. The patriarch of the Nichols family had departed, taking an entire era of rugged dignity with him. I sat in the dim light for a long time, the drumming rain serving as my only companion. I did not scream. I did not collapse onto the floor. The logistics manager inside me compartmentalized the shock, folding the raw agony into a tight box to be unpacked later. Right now, there were protocols to follow. There were medical authorities to notify, transport arrangements to coordinate, and a profound hollow void in the universe to navigate. The dawn brought a harsh, glaring reality. The storm broke, leaving the mountains slick and shrouded in lingering fog. I stood in the kitchen, holding my cracked cell phone. I had to make the phone call I had been dreading for 6 months. I had to alert David and Patricia that their father had passed away. The protective bubble surrounding the mountain cabin had burst. My period of quiet caregiving had concluded, and the brutal reckoning of the estate was about to commence. The predators were going to descend upon the Blue Ridge Mountains. They would arrive draped in expensive black clothing, eager to perform a grotesque pantomime of mourning for the local community. They would come searching for property deeds, bank accounts, and the remaining assets they believed were rightfully theirs. They thought they had defeated me when they left me off their trust. They assumed Henry's death was the final obstacle, clearing their path to an unearned fortune. I picked up the silver pocket watch from the kitchen counter, the metal cool and heavy in my palm. I slipped it into my pocket, a physical reminder of my bedside vow. The real shipment was coming in, and I had zero concept of what kind of explosive freight my grandfather had arranged in that Atlanta boardroom. I dialed my parents' number, listening to the digital ringing tone echo in the empty cabin. I braced my shoulders for the incoming assault. The funeral facade was about to begin, and I knew Brandon would waste zero time asking for the keys to the kingdom. The transition from the crisp elevation of the Blue Ridge Mountains to the suffocating humidity of the Georgia coast felt like descending into a heavy, stagnant swamp. My grandfather had purchased a burial plot decades ago, insisting he be laid to rest beside his late wife in the coastal marshlands just outside Savannah. Fulfilling his final wish required a complex sequence of logistical maneuvers. I coordinated the transport of his remains, negotiated with the cemetery director, secured the permits, and arranged for a modest graveside service. I functioned on mechanical momentum. Grief is a heavy burden, but planning a funeral forces you to pack that grief into a tight compartment so you can manage the schedule. I stood near the edge of the open grave, my sensible flat shoes sinking slightly into the soft, damp earth. The air smelled of salt pluff mud and impending rain. Thick, gray Spanish moss hung from the branches of the ancient live oak trees, swaying in the sluggish ocean breeze. I wore a plain, unadorned, dark dress. It was practical attire for a woman managing the moving parts of a burial. I held a clipboard in my left hand, verifying the arrival of the florist and handing a final check to the pastor. My parents had contributed nothing to these arrangements. When I called them from the mountain to inform them of Henry's passing, David simply cleared his throat and told me to handle the details, claiming his capital was tied up in a quarterly investment cycle. I drained my own depleted savings account to pay for the casket and the burial fees. The low crunch of gravel signaled the arrival of my family. A sleek black luxury town car pulled up to the edge of the cemetery grass. The driver stepped out and opened the rear doors. David, Patricia, Brandon, and Amanda emerged into the humid morning light. They looked as though they had stepped off the pages of a high-fashion editorial focused on mourning attire. My mother wore a structured designer black suit with a tailored pencil skirt and a wide-brimmed hat casting a dramatic shadow over her face. My father wore a bespoke dark suit, his silver tie pinned perfectly in place. Brandon sported a tailored black tuxedo-style jacket, while Amanda wore a sheer, inappropriate cocktail dress that clung tightly to her frame. They did not walk toward the casket. They walked toward the small crowd of mourners gathering under the canvas tent. The local community had turned out to pay their respects. Retired railroad engineers, old neighbors, and coastal fishermen who had known my grandfather for decades stood in quiet clusters. My family immediately initiated a grotesque performance of sorrow. David moved through the crowd, shaking hands with a firm, practiced grip, playing the role of the stoic patriarch, carrying the weight of a devastating loss. Patricia fluttered between the folding chairs, pressing a pristine white lace handkerchief to her dry eyes. She nodded solemnly at strangers, accepting their condolences, with soft, rehearsed whispers about how much she would miss her beloved father-in-law. They were monetizing his death for social currency. They were harvesting the sympathy of the local community, portraying themselves as the loving, devastated family members. It was a sickening display of hypocrisy, considering they had spent the last 6 months ignoring his existence and plotting to steal his autonomy. I stood near the floral arrangements, watching the theatrical production unfold with cold detachment. I marked off the final delivery on my clipboard and turned to place it on a spare chair. As I moved, I caught sight of Amanda near the cascading white lilies I had purchased. She held her smartphone elevated at a high angle, capturing the perfect lighting. Her lips were pursed in an exaggerated pout. I watched her tap the screen to begin recording. "It is just such a hard day," Amanda whispered to her front-facing camera, forcing a slight quiver into her vocal fry. "We are saying goodbye to our family patriarch. He was such a guiding light for my husband. Hold your loved ones close today, guys. You never know when it will be your last moment with them." She paused, holding her tragic expression for 2 more seconds before tapping the screen to end the recording. The moment the red light vanished, her face dropped into a blank, bored stare. She scrutinized the playback using the reflection of the glass to check her mascara. She ran a manicured finger under her lower lash line, adjusted a stray lock of hair, and swiftly hit the post button. She transformed a solemn burial ground into a content farm without a single shred of shame. The pastor stepped up to the wooden podium, clearing his throat to signal the beginning of the service. The murmuring crowd settled into the folding chairs. I took my place in the back row, preferring to stand. I did not want to sit next to the people who had abandoned the man in the wooden box. The pastor spoke about Henry's dedication to the railroad, his rugged independence, and his enduring love for his late wife. The words were comforting, genuine, and grounded in reality. I closed my eyes, letting the cadence of the sermon wash over me, trying to summon the memory of the pine and sea salt scent from the mountain cabin. A sharp tug on my elbow yanked me back to the present. Brandon stood beside me. His jaw was clenched tight, and a thin layer of perspiration coated his forehead. It was not the coastal humidity causing him to sweat. He emanated a frantic, nervous energy, his eyes darting toward the polished oak casket resting on the metal lowering device. He leaned in close, his designer cologne failing to mask the sour scent of his panic. "We need to talk," he muttered under his breath, his grip tightening on my arm. I pulled my elbow out of his grasp, stepping backward. "The service is happening right now, Brandon. Sit down." He ignored my instruction, taking another step into my personal space. "I do not have time for a sermon, Nicole. My bridge loan fell through yesterday. The lender pulled out when they ran a secondary credit check. I am facing default on 3 different commercial properties by the end of the week." I stared at him, my expression unreadable. "Your financial mismanagement is not my logistical problem." He grit his teeth, glancing over his shoulder to ensure our parents were occupied, listening to the pastor. He was desperate. "You were living in that cabin for 6 months. You packed up his belongings. Tell me where he kept the property deeds. I need the title to the mountain house and the marshland plots today. If I can present those deeds to a private investor as collateral by tomorrow morning, I can secure a line of credit and save my startup." A cold wave of revulsion washed through my veins. The pastor was less than 30 feet away, reading a final scripture over our grandfather's body. The casket had not even been lowered into the damp earth, and my brother was demanding the keys to the kingdom. He viewed the wooden box in front of us as a winning lottery ticket, and he expected me to hand over the combination. I recalled the final moments in the mountain cabin. I remembered the fierce grip of Henry's cold hand and the urgent whisper cutting through the sound of the rain. The real shipment is coming in. Do not let them touch the cargo. I leveled my gaze at my brother. My posture was rigid, my boundaries forged in iron. I do not have any deeds, Brandon. I do not have any titles. Do not play games with me, he hissed, his face flushing red. You were his caretaker. You had access to everything. Tell me where the paperwork is hidden. I folded my arms across my chest, channeling the quiet authority of the man we were supposed to be mourning. You have no right to anything on that mountain, I said softly. You have no claim to this land. You abandoned him when he needed you, and now you want to pick his bones clean to pay your debts? My answer is no. Brandon raised his hand, pointing a trembling finger at my face. You are holding out on me because you want a cut of the sale. You think you can leverage those properties to force a settlement. You are going to regret this, Nicole. I will have my lawyers tear your life apart. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. The estate is out of my hands, I replied. The legal documentation is secured with his attorneys. If you want to discuss collateral, you can take it up with them, assuming they even take your call. I turned my back on him and walked toward the front of the tent. I left him standing near the edge of the grave, suffocating in his own manufactured crisis. The pastor concluded the service. The funeral directors engaged the mechanical gears, and the oak casket began its slow, inevitable descent into the ground. I watched the polished wood disappear beneath the surface, feeling a profound sense of finality. The caregiving chapter of my life had officially closed. I had kept my promise. I had protected him until the very end. The mourners dispersed, heading toward their vehicles. David and Patricia walked past me without offering a single word of comfort. They climbed into the back of their luxury town car, eager to return to their climate-controlled lives and plan their impending financial windfall. Brandon and Amanda followed closely behind, their faces tight with anxiety and greed. They drove away, leaving me alone in the humid marshland to oversee the cemetery workers filling the grave. I stood there until the final mound of earth was patted down into place. I smoothed my simple dark dress, feeling a strange, hollow anticipation brewing in my chest. My family believed the game was over. They believed they had outlasted the stubborn old man and outsmarted the quiet, subservient daughter. They assumed the wealth was theirs for the taking. They possessed zero knowledge of the elite corporate law firm in Atlanta. They had no idea about the heavy leather briefcase, the hidden strategy, or the explosive legal trap waiting to snap shut. 2 weeks later, the silence would break. The United States Postal Service would deliver a certified, registered letter to my parents' Savannah home. The crest of Mr. Lawson's firm would be stamped on the envelope, carrying a formal summons that would drag the Nichols family into a high-rise boardroom and shatter their delusions forever. 14 days crept by in a hollow haze following the burial in the coastal marshlands. The mountain cabin felt cavernous without my grandfather's quiet presence. I spent those 2 weeks packing his clothes into cardboard boxes and organizing his remaining personal effects. The silence of the isolated forest offered a temporary shield from the chaos brewing down on the coast. That fragile peace shattered precisely on the morning of the 15th day. The local postal carrier navigated the steep dirt driveway to hand me a certified envelope. The return address bore the crest of the elite Atlanta law firm. It was a formal summons. The estate reading was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning. I drove back into the city, retracing the exact route I had taken with Henry months prior. The morning sky over Atlanta was a crisp, cloudless blue. The towering skyscrapers of the financial district gleamed in the sunlight, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete pavement. I parked my sedan in the subterranean garage, navigating the labyrinth of executive spaces until I reached the express elevator. The ride to the 42nd floor felt entirely different this time. I was no longer a frantic caregiver operating a mobile command center from a lobby sofa. I was a logistics manager, stepping into a finalized supply chain, waiting to witness the delivery of the cargo. The receptionist guided me down a long mahogany-paneled corridor. We reached a set of heavy double doors leading into the primary boardroom. I pushed the brass handle and stepped inside the vast, opulent space. My family had already arrived. They occupied the plush leather chairs on one side of a long, polished marble conference table. David and Patricia sat close together, their posture radiating an arrogant, unmistakable confidence. My mother wore a pristine white tailored suit, a stark departure from her theatrical mourning attire at the cemetery. She looked radiant, refreshed, and entirely unburdened by grief. My father leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of sparkling water, projecting the smug aura of a man about to close a highly lucrative corporate merger. Brandon sat next to them, his knee bouncing in a rapid, nervous rhythm beneath the table. He wore a sharp gray suit, but the dark circles under his eyes betrayed his mounting desperation. His real estate startup was hemorrhaging capital by the hour, and he viewed this meeting as his singular lifeline. Amanda sat beside him, tapping away on her smartphone screen, completely detached from the legal reality of the room. She was likely browsing luxury real estate listings or planning her next curated vacation, prematurely spending the inheritance they believed was guaranteed. I took a seat on the opposite side of the long marble table. The physical distance mirrored the emotional canyon separating us. "Ah, the hired help finally arrives," David remarked, setting his glass down with a soft clink. His tone was laced with casual condescension. "Did you remember to bring the original death certificates, Nicole? The attorneys will need them to expedite the transfer of the property deeds." I placed my plain leather tote bag on the floor next to my chair. "I brought everything required," I replied, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. Patricia offered a tight, patronizing smile. "Well, we appreciate you handling the grim logistics at the end. I am sure it was a tedious chore. We can take over the heavy lifting from here. You should take detailed notes during this meeting, dear. Brandon will need to know exactly how quickly the mountain cabin and the marshland plots can be liquidated. He has an urgent deadline with his investors." They were practically giddy. The air in the room buzzed with their toxic anticipation. They spoke about Henry's lifelong assets as if they were discussing the sale of discarded furniture. There was zero reverence for the man who had built that wealth. There was zero acknowledgement of the profound loss. They viewed my grandfather as a locked vault, and they firmly believed this meeting was the moment they finally received the combination code. Furthermore, they treated me like a low-level secretary. They assumed my presence in the boardroom was merely a procedural formality. They believed I was only summoned because I had served as the medical proxy and the caretaker. In their minds, I was the administrative assistant, invited to hand over the paperwork before being dismissed back to the shipping port. I did not argue. I did not correct their insulting assumptions. I sat silently in my leather chair, applying my professional supply chain mindset to the unfolding scene. A good logistics manager does not react to the noise. She observes the variables. She tracks the moving parts. I studied my father's triumphant posture. I analyzed my mother's greedy, calculating smile. I registered my brother's frantic, twitching knee. They had built an entire ecosystem of delusion. They formulated their plans based on the assumption that they were the primary beneficiaries. They never considered the possibility that Henry possessed a mind of his own. They never factored in the secret trip to this exact building. They were operating on flawed data, and their entire structural foundation was about to collapse. The silence in the opulent boardroom deepened. broken only by a distinct, rhythmic sound echoing from the far corner of the space. A vintage grandfather clock stood against the mahogany-paneled wall. Its polished brass pendulum swung back and forth in a steady, hypnotic arc. The mechanical heartbeat of the antique timepiece amplified the unbearable psychological tension filling the room. Every passing second felt heavy, dragging the family closer to the edge of an invisible cliff. Brandon checked his designer wristwatch, his patience wearing dangerously thin. "Where is this lawyer?" he muttered, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple. "We have commercial buyers waiting for confirmation on those coastal lots. This delay is costing my firm money." "Relax, son," David said, offering a reassuring pat on Brandon's shoulder. "The legal process takes a moment to initiate. By lunchtime, you will have the collateral you need to secure your bridge loan. Our family legacy is perfectly intact." The pendulum swung. The gears locked into place. The final countdown reached 0. The heavy double doors at the end of the boardroom opened with a solid, echoing thud. The ambient chatter at the table ceased instantly. Mr. Lawson stepped into the room. He wore a sharply tailored navy suit, identical to the one he had worn months ago during his secret rendezvous with my grandfather. His demeanor was ice cold, radiating an intimidating predatory authority. He did not offer a warm greeting. He did not offer empty condolences for their loss. He moved with the precise, calculated efficiency of a surgeon preparing to make a very deep, very painful incision. In his left hand, he carried a thick, sealed manila envelope. Mr. Lawson walked to the head of the marble table and took his seat. He placed the heavy envelope on the polished surface, the dull slap of the paper silencing the final murmurs of anticipation. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the faces of the people seated before him. His gaze lingered briefly on David, then shifted to Patricia, and finally settled on Brandon. There was no pity in his eyes. There was only the cold, unyielding weight of the law. "Good morning," Mr. Lawson said, his voice dropping into a low, commanding register that demanded total submission from the room. "We are gathered here today to execute the final wishes of Henry Nichols. I advise all of you to listen very carefully. The terms contained within this document are non-negotiable, binding, and immediately effective." My parents leaned forward in their chairs, their eyes locked hungrily on the manila envelope. They were entirely confident that they were about to inherit everything. They were ready to claim their unearned prize. I remained perfectly still in my seat. I listened to the steady ticking of the vintage clock, knowing the explosive cargo my grandfather had arranged was finally hitting the loading dock. The stage was set for the ultimate reckoning, and the Nichols family facade was seconds away from total devastation. Mr. Lawson broke the heavy red wax seal on the manila envelope. The crisp tear of the thick archival paper sounded like a snapping bone in the silent boardroom. He withdrew a bound stack of legal documents printed on premium watermarked stock. He did not rush the process. He meticulously aligned the edges of the pages against the polished marble table, establishing total command over the pacing of our impending destruction. He treated the document with the reverence of a sacred text, demanding the room pay attention to the weight of his actions. David crossed his legs, exuding an air of bored impatience. "Let us expedite this process, counselor," my father instructed. "We all understand the basic framework of my father's estate. You can skip the boilerplate sentimentality and move directly to the distribution of the real assets. Brandon has investors waiting on standby for the commercial backing. We do not have all morning to reminisce." Mr. Lawson did not blink. He looked over the rim of his reading glasses, his gaze stripping David of his manufactured authority. "This document contains 0 boilerplate sentimentality," Mr. Nichols, the attorney, replied, his tone chillingly flat and devoid of customer service courtesy. Your father drafted this final testament with razor-sharp precision. I will read it exactly as he instructed. If you interrupt me again, I will have security escort you to the lobby, and you will receive your notification via certified mail. Do we have a mutual understanding? My father stiffened his jaw, tightening, but he remained silent. Brandon shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the first genuine flicker of doubt crossing his face. Mr. Lawson turned his attention to the first page. I, Henry Joseph Nichols, being of sound mind and pristine clarity, do hereby declare this document to be my last will and testament, superseding all prior arrangements, trusts, and assumed legacies. The attorney paused, allowing the legal weight to settle over the marble table. He cleared his throat and continued reading my grandfather's own words. A man measures his true wealth not by the balance in his accounts, but by the character of those standing beside him when the bitter winter arrives. For the last decade of my life, I have observed the character of my son David and his wife Patricia. I found their character entirely bankrupt. Patricia gasped. She sat bolt upright, her pristine white suit suddenly looking absurdly out of place against the harsh reality of her exposed cruelty. She looked around the room as if searching for a manager to complain to, but there was no higher authority here. Mr. Lawson kept reading, showing zero mercy. They viewed my aging as an inconvenience to their social calendar. They treated my fierce independence as a liability. When my health faltered, they did not offer a steady hand or a warm home. Instead, they conspired to strip me of my autonomy. They plotted to lock me away in a sterile, impersonal facility. They intended to liquidate the home I built with my own hands to fund the reckless, fraudulent endeavors of their son, Brandon. The air in the boardroom grew thin. I watched my mother's hands tremble. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning bone white under the fluorescent lights. Patricia pressed her perfectly manicured fingernails so hard into the expensive wood that a faint, desperate scratch etched itself into the polished surface. The tiny physical destruction mirrored the tearing of her meticulously crafted social facade. The sound of acrylic dragging against the grain was agonizing. "This is outrageous!" David sputtered, his face flushing a volatile shade of crimson. "That is slander. My father was clearly suffering from severe dementia when he wrote this. He was confused. He did not know what he was signing." Mr. Lawson lowered the document. He produced a secondary folder from beneath the primary stack, sliding it smoothly across the marble surface. Attached to this will are 3 separate psychological evaluations conducted by leading independent neurologists in the state of Georgia, the attorney stated. Your father anticipated your exact accusation. They all certified him to be functioning with perfect cognitive clarity on the day he signed this document. He was not confused, David. He saw you with perfect vision. My father recoiled as if he had been physically struck. Brandon ceased his nervous knee bouncing, a sickening dread washing over his features. Amanda stopped scrolling on her smartphone, her head snapping up. She finally registered that her curated lifestyle built entirely on the promise of future money was under direct threat. Mr. Lawson resumed his reading. Because the law requires me to acknowledge my legal heirs to prevent claims of oversight, I must address the distribution of assets to my son, my daughter-in-law, and my grandson. Brandon leaned forward, a desperate glimmer of hope reigniting in his eyes. He still believed he was about to receive a payout. He assumed the harsh words were merely the bitter ramblings of an old man who would eventually surrender the cash anyway. He thought he could endure a quick lecture in exchange for the property deeds. To David Nichols, Patricia Nichols, and Brandon Nichols. Mr. Lawson read, enunciating every single syllable with surgical precision. I leave the sum of exactly $1 each. This sum is designated specifically so no legal counsel can ever argue they were forgotten or inadvertently omitted from this estate. You are acknowledged, and you are dismissed. A profound, suffocating vacuum consumed the boardroom. The vintage grandfather clock ticked in the corner, marking the exact second the Nichols family delusion imploded. $1. My grandfather had utilized a brilliant legal maneuver to officially, permanently disinherit them. He weaponized the law to validate my sacrifices and expose their greed on the permanent public record. It was a flawless execution of supply chain diversion. He had rerouted their entire future. The silence broke with a sudden, unhinged explosion of denial. "This is a forgery!" Brandon shouted, slamming both palms flat against the marble table. He jumped to his feet, his tailored gray suit wrinkling around the shoulders. "That bitter old man would never do this to me. I carry his last name. I am the future of this family. You manipulated him, Nicole." He turned his venom toward me, his eyes wide and frantic, a vein bulging in his neck. "You orchestrated this entire stunt when you isolated him on that mountain. You brainwashed him into cutting us out because you are a jealous, lonely spinster." I did not flinch. I sat quietly in my leather chair, watching his entire identity unravel in real time. "You cut yourselves out, Brandon," I said softly. "You just expected me to hand over the scissors." David stood up, pointing a trembling finger at the attorney. "We will tie this estate up in probate court for the next 10 years. You think you can humiliate us with a $1 inheritance? We will contest every single syllable of that fraudulent document. We will drag your firm through the mud. We will hire our own litigators." Patricia joined the chorus of rage, desperately attempting to salvage her shattered pride. "And for what?" She spat, her voice shrill and echoing off the glass walls. "You went through all this theatrical trouble over a worthless pile of dirt. My father-in-law owned a rotting log cabin and a few acres of mosquito-infested swamp water down by the coast. The land is practically unbuildable. We were going to sell it for pennies just to get it off the tax ledger. You are fighting over scraps, Nicole. You ruined our family for a worthless plot of mud." They were frantically clinging to their false superiority. They needed to believe the estate was insignificant. If the assets were worthless, then losing them did not matter. They could walk away with their egos bruised but structurally intact. They could convince themselves that I had won a meaningless prize, a hollow victory that left me stranded in a dilapidated cabin, while they returned to their suburban luxury. Mr. Lawson did not raise his voice to compete with their screaming. He simply waited for them to run out of oxygen. He watched them throw their tantrums with the detached fascination of a scientist observing an unpredictable chemical reaction. When their shouts faded into heavy, ragged breathing, the attorney reached up and calmly adjusted the frame of his glasses. A sharp, predatory smile curved the edges of his mouth. It was the smile of a hunter, watching a trapped animal step directly onto the trigger plate. "A worthless plot of mud," Mr. Lawson repeated. The quiet resonance of his voice sent a sudden chill down my spine. He flipped to the final page of the heavy document. He ran his index finger down the list of codified assets, allowing the suspense to stretch until the air in the room felt thick enough to shatter. My grandfather's hidden logistics were about to manifest. The inbound freight was clearing customs. The cargo was finally reaching the dock. "I think," Mr. Lawson said, his sharp smile deepening into something devastating, "we need to have a serious conversation about the true nature of your father's financial portfolio." The attorney looked directly at me, a silent, profound acknowledgement passing between us. He prepared to drop a corporate bombshell that would eradicate my parents' reality, rewrite my entire future, and prove that Henry Nichols had engineered the greatest logistical counterstrike in the history of the Georgia coast. Mr. Lawson steepled his fingers, leaning forward over the polished marble table. He directed his gaze toward Patricia, letting her derogatory assessment of the estate hang in the chilled air of the boardroom. "A worthless plot of mud," he repeated, his tone dry and surgical. "It is fascinating how ignorance often masquerades as superiority, Patricia. You evaluated a book entirely by a dust jacket you never bothered to open." My mother bristled, her jaw tightening. She opened her mouth to issue a sharp retort, but the attorney held up a single authoritative hand, forcing her into submission. "Your father-in-law was a railroad engineer," Mr. Lawson explained, shifting his focus to David. "He spent 40 years observing the movement of freight across the eastern seaboard. He understood the intricate arteries of commerce long before the modern shipping boom materialized. He knew that trains needed tracks, but ships required deep-water frontage, and more importantly, he understood scarcity." The lawyer reached into the thick manila envelope and extracted a large, folded document. He spread it open across the table. It was a highly detailed surveyor map overlaid with complex zoning grids and maritime boundary lines. 50 years ago, Mr. Lawson continued, his voice echoing in the silent room. Henry purchased several miles of coastal marshland just outside the Savannah city limits. To the untrained eye, and certainly to yours, it appeared to be nothing more than a swamp, infested with mosquitoes and draped in Spanish moss. He paid a negligible sum for it. He let it sit undisturbed. He paid the minimal property taxes every year and never mentioned it to anyone. He let the world believe he was just a stubborn old man clinging to a piece of useless dirt. I leaned forward in my leather chair. My logistical brain began piecing together the geographical coordinates printed on the map. I recognized the topography. I stared at the grid lines, a sudden electric shock of comprehension racing down my spine. That specific stretch of coastline was situated directly adjacent to the primary commercial shipping channel. It was the exact location where the global logistics corporations were currently fighting bloody zoning wars, trying to expand their freight terminals. But Henry did not just buy the physical dirt, the attorney stated, tracing a manicured finger along the blue ink denoting the shoreline. He possessed the foresight to secure the commercial logistical development rights. He locked in the maritime access corridors, the deep water dredging permits, and the exclusive commercial zoning designations before the state legislature tightened the regulations. Those permits are grandfathered in. They are irrevocable. David swallowed hard, the arrogant color draining rapidly from his cheeks. His eyes darted across the surveyor map, his corporate instincts finally waking up to the staggering reality of his father's hidden strategy. "What are you saying?" my father asked, his voice cracking into a dry, breathless whisper. "I am saying the global economy shifted," Mr. Lawson replied smoothly. "The Panama Canal was widened. The era of mega cargo ships arrived. E-commerce exploded, and the port of Savannah became one of the most critical logistical hubs on the planet. The major shipping conglomerates are desperate for expansion space, but they are landlocked by environmental restrictions, except for one particular stretch of coastline." The attorney paused, allowing the gravity of the situation to settle over the Nichols family. "Last month, acting on Henry's explicit instructions, this firm commissioned an independent Tier 1 corporate valuation of those grandfathered development rights," Mr. Lawson said. "We fielded blind inquiries from 3 global maritime conglomerates. The bidding war was fierce. The market value of that specific stretch of coastal mud has escalated beyond standard real estate metrics. It is no longer evaluated by the acre. It is evaluated by its monopoly on regional supply chain access." Brandon stopped breathing. He sat frozen in his tailored gray suit, his eyes fixed on the surveyor map as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. Amanda lowered her smartphone, the glowing screen reflecting off her suddenly pale face. The curated influencer fantasy she inhabited was evaporating under the harsh fluorescent lights. The verified current market valuation of Henry Nichols' estate, Mr. Lawson announced, enunciating every syllable with devastating clarity, is $42 million. The number detonated inside the boardroom like a seismic charge. $42 million. The resulting silence was not merely quiet. It was a suffocating, crushing vacuum. It was the sound of a false reality collapsing inward. David opened his mouth, but his vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a ledge, suspended in the agonizing second before gravity pulls him down. Patricia sat immobilized, her pristine white suit offering zero protection against the monumental scale of her miscalculation. The inheritance she dismissed as a petty chore was a staggering fortune. Brandon held a heavy, expensive gold pen in his right hand. His fingers went limp. The pen slipped from his grasp. It fell toward the floor, striking the hardwood with a sharp, piercing clack. The metallic sound echoed off the glass walls, a solitary punctuation mark verifying the death of his unearned entitlement. The golden child was bankrupt, and his salvation had just slipped through his trembling fingers. Mr. Lawson did not offer them a moment to recover. He drove the final nail into the coffin with swift, surgical precision. As per the binding terms of this irrevocable trust, the attorney concluded, looking directly into my eyes, 100% of the estate, the mountain cabin, the coastal properties, the grandfathered development rights, and the entirety of the $42 million valuation are bequeathed to his sole designated beneficiary and caretaker, Nicole Nichols. A profound, electrifying warmth flooded my chest. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly on the armrests of my leather chair. I felt the invisible, crushing weight of my childhood conditioning dissolve into thin air. I was no longer the invisible daughter. I was no longer the reliable scapegoat expected to absorb the financial failures of an entitled brother. I was the sole owner of a logistical empire. My grandfather had not merely left me a sum of money. He handed me the keys to the very industry I had spent my entire adult life mastering. He knew my capabilities. He watched me reroute cargo ships and manage supply chains from a laptop on his rustic dining table. He recognized the sharp, pragmatic executive existing beneath the surface of a dutiful granddaughter. He built an ironclad fortress of wealth and placed me on the throne. The real shipment is coming in. Do not let them touch the cargo. His final whispered words echoed in my mind, their meaning finally unlocking with stunning clarity. He orchestrated this entire maneuver to ensure I possessed the structural power to defend myself. He weaponized his legacy to obliterate the toxic hierarchy of our family tree. I looked across the polished marble table. The power dynamic had inverted so thoroughly it felt like gravity itself had reversed direction. David stared at me, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate realization. The daughter he discarded to keep things simple was now the most powerful individual in the room. He realized I controlled the commercial acreage his firm would likely beg to utilize. Patricia clutched her throat, her face flushed with a toxic mixture of humiliation and sudden agonizing regret. She had kicked dirt on a buried treasure chest, and now she was locked outside the vault forever. I did not offer them a reassuring smile. I did not utter a single word to ease their psychological freefall. I applied the ruthless efficiency of a global supply chain manager to my own existence. I secured the cargo. I verified the manifest. I owned the port. The boardroom remained trapped in that suffocating silence, the vintage grandfather clock ticking relentlessly in the corner. The Nichols family sat paralyzed, suffocating under the colossal weight of their own greed. They had spent decades building a house of cards, stacking their egos upon a foundation of deceit and favoritism. Then the fragile structure finally buckled. Brandon let out a low, ragged gasp. He gripped the edge of the marble table, his knuckles turning white as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. The reality of his situation crashed into him, stripping away the polished veneer of his designer suit and his arrogant posturing. He was staring down the barrel of financial ruin, and the only person capable of saving him was the sister he had mocked, belittled, and attempted to exploit. His tailored facade was about to shatter, and the ensuing collapse would expose a truth far darker than anyone in that room had anticipated. The reckoning was far from over. It was just shifting targets. The heavy gold pen lay motionless on the polished hardwood floor, catching the harsh glare of the boardroom lights. Nobody moved to pick it up. The silence in the room shifted from profound shock to a suffocating, mounting terror. Brandon remained frozen in his chair, but his body betrayed the pristine image he had spent his entire adult life projecting. His breath hitched, catching in his throat in short, ragged gasps. He clawed at the knot of his silk tie, pulling it loose as if the fabric were suddenly strangling him. A dark, spreading sweat stain began to seep into the crisp cotton collar of his tailored designer shirt. The moisture crept upward from his neck, turning the pale blue fabric into a bruised, damp ring of sheer panic. The confident, arrogant entrepreneur who had demanded I co-sign a predatory loan merely months ago was dissolving right before my eyes. He looked like a drowning man grasping at a life raft made of smoke. "This cannot be happening," Brandon whispered, his voice trembling, stripped of its usual smooth pitch. He looked wildly at the attorney. "You have to fix this, Lawson. You have to reverse the paperwork. I am the primary heir. I carry the family name." Mr. Lawson folded his hands on the marble table, his expression resembling a stone monument. "I do not fix reality, Mr. Nichols. I simply present it. The estate is settled." The finality of the lawyer's words acted as a physical blow. Brandon doubled over, burying his face in his trembling hands. A low, guttural sob ripped through his chest, a sound so raw and ugly it made the air in the room feel toxic. The facade shattered entirely, and the ugly, terrifying truth he had been hiding behind his leased luxury vehicles and tailored suits came spilling out in a frantic wave of verbal vomit. "I am ruined." Brandon choked out his words, tumbling over each other in a frantic rush. "The real estate startup is a shell. It is all a shell. The investors started asking for their quarterly dividends, and I did not have the capital. The zoning permits were denied 6 months ago. I diverted their initial deposits to cover my previous business debts and keep the luxury rental lawsuits quiet." David grabbed the edge of the conference table, his face draining of whatever color had returned. "What are you saying, Brandon? What did you do with the investor capital?" "I spent it," Brandon cried, lifting his tear-streaked face to look at our horrified father. "I had to maintain the image. You taught me to maintain the image. I moved the funds through dummy accounts. The sum is $2 million in the red." The entire boardroom seemed to tilt on its axis. $2 million of stolen capital. "It gets worse," Brandon stammered, hyperventilating now. "The federal regulators flagged the transfers last week. I am under active investigation for wire fraud. The agents are auditing the ledgers as we speak. I needed those coastal deeds today. I had a shadow lender willing to accept the grandfathered port rights as collateral. I was going to use the loan to replace the missing investor funds before the grand jury convenes on Friday. If I default by the end of the week, I am going to federal prison. The golden child, the brilliant risk-taker my parents had sacrificed my inheritance to protect, was a white-collar criminal staring down a federal indictment. A sharp, piercing shriek shattered the remaining quiet. Amanda leaped out of her chair, the legs screeching against the hardwood floor. Her flawless, curated mask of influencer perfection disintegrated into genuine, unadulterated horror. She stared at her husband as if he had just transformed into a monster. "You told me the audit was a routine tax review," Amanda screamed, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "You told me the business was scaling. I just posted a luxury unboxing video yesterday. I showed my followers the diamond tennis bracelet you bought me for our anniversary. Did you buy that with stolen money?" Brandon reached a shaking hand toward her, but she recoiled in disgust. "Amanda, please. I was trying to provide the lifestyle we deserve." "You provided a federal crime scene!" she shrieked, her face contorting with rage. "Every designer handbag, every leased car, the vacation to Aspen, it is all fraudulent. The authorities are going to freeze my bank accounts. They are going to seize my assets. My entire brand is built on a lie, and you just lit a match under my career. I will not go to jail for your gross incompetence." She hurled her expensive designer purse directly at his chest. The heavy leather struck him, spilling cosmetics and credit cards across the marble table. She turned her back on him, sobbing hysterically, realizing her marriage and her social standing had just imploded in the span of 5 minutes. David and Patricia sat immobilized, watching their meticulously crafted dynasty burn to ash. Their son was a felon. Their daughter-in-law was threatening divorce in front of the estate attorney. The quiet dignity of a high-level corporate boardroom was replaced by the chaotic noise of a spectacular moral failure. David clutched his chest, struggling to process the monumental scale of his son's deceit. Patricia pressed a trembling hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with undisguised terror. Then the pivot occurred. It was a terrifying psychological phenomenon to witness. The shock faded from my parents' faces, rapidly replaced by a desperate, calculated survival instinct. They realized they did not possess the liquid capital to pay off a $2 million restitution. Their own wealth was tied up in suburban real estate and fluctuating retirement accounts. They were powerless to stop the federal government from taking their son, unless they found a new source of funding. Patricia turned her head, slowly locking her sights on me. The cruel, dismissive sneer she had worn less than an hour ago vanished without a trace. The woman who had called me a parasite in the mountain cabin tucked away her venom. In its place, a sickly sweet, trembling smile stretched across her face. It was a grotesque, manufactured imitation of maternal warmth, a mask slipped on to hide a predator cornered by circumstance. "Nicole, sweetheart," Patricia coos, taking a hesitant step in my direction. Her voice dripped with artificial affection, the tone she used when attempting to coax a favor from a wealthy neighbor. "We are all in such a terrible state of shock. But you heard your brother. He made a terrible mistake, a foolish, youthful business error. You have $42 million now. You own an empire. You have more than enough resources to fix this tiny misunderstanding." David instantly joined the charade, nodding his head with forced vigor. He attempted to summon a tone of paternal pride, though it sounded hollow, desperate, and deeply strained. "Your grandfather left you the estate because he knew you were responsible," David reasoned, twisting the narrative with breathtaking speed. "He knew you had the logistical mind to protect this family when a crisis hit. That is why he trusted you with the heavy lifting, Nicole. We need you to do the right thing. Write a check to clear your brother's debt. Keep him out of federal court. Save our family reputation. You are our only hope. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, studying their desperate, pleading faces. My mind operated with the cold precision of a supply chain algorithm evaluating a critical failure. This was the ultimate hypocrisy of abusers. They spent 32 years convincing me I was a burden, a supporting character, existing merely to facilitate their grand production. They evicted me from their trust to keep things simple. They insulted my career. They tried to bully a dying old man, and when I stood in their way, they dragged my name through the mud. Now, the precise moment their manufactured world faced genuine consequences, they demanded grace from the very victim they had spent a lifetime discarding. They expected me to play the dutiful savior. They assumed my childhood conditioning remained intact, believing that a few sweet words and the invocation of family loyalty would override decades of blatant neglect. They wanted me to utilize my inherited fortress to purchase a get-out-of-jail-free card for an unrepentant criminal. The audacity of their request tasted like copper in my mouth. I looked at Brandon, shivering in his sweat-soaked shirt, terrified of the prison cell waiting for him. I looked at Amanda, weeping over her ruined influencer brand. I looked at David and Patricia, wearing their predatory smiles, expecting me to sacrifice my grandfather's legacy to fund their continued delusion. To save Brandon would mean validating every lie they ever told. It would mean financing my own continued subjugation. Henry Nichols did not arm me with a $42 million maritime monopoly just so I could lower the drawbridge for the enemy. He gave me the resources to build an entirely new supply chain, one devoid of toxic variables and parasitic demands. The time for negotiation had officially expired. I gathered my paperwork, preparing to deliver the final verdict, locking my sights on the people who had taught me exactly how to survive their cruelty. I watched the artificial sweetness congeal on my mother's face. The desperation in her eyes was palpable, a raw, naked terror attempting to disguise itself as maternal affection. She was asking me to write a multi-million-dollar check to cover a federal crime. She was asking me to purchase a pardon for the son who had spent his entire life mocking my work ethic. A global supply chain manager learns to identify toxic assets early. When a shipping route consistently loses cargo, you do not funnel more capital into the failing channel. You sever the contract. You reroute the freight. You eliminate the variable causing the systemic failure. My family was a systemic failure. I placed my hands flat on the polished marble table and pushed my chair backward. The leather groaned softly in the quiet room. I stood up to my full height. The physical shift in elevation forced David, Patricia, and Brandon to tilt their heads backward to maintain eye contact. I looked down at them, feeling the immense, crushing weight of their expectations slide off my shoulders and shatter against the hardwood floor. Brandon was weeping openly now, his shoulders shaking beneath his ruined designer suit. "Nicole, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic whine. "The federal agents are going to raid my office. I will lose everything. I will not survive in prison." "You have $42 million. $2 million is a fraction of your net worth. It is a rounding error. You owe me this. We are blood." I studied his tear-streaked face, noting the stark contrast between his current humiliation and the arrogant smirk he wore when he demanded I co-sign his predatory loan at the warehouse. He still believed he was entitled to my labor and my resources. He just altered his strategy from bullying to groveling. I looked Brandon dead in the eye, my voice devoid of anger, pity, or warmth. "To keep things simple, my answer is no," I said. The words hung in the chilled air of the boardroom, a perfect symmetrical echo of the exact phrase our father had used to disinherit me in the sunroom months ago. Brandon's jaw dropped. He blinked rapidly, unable to process the rejection. He had spent his entire existence receiving a definitive yes from the universe, funded by the bank of his parents. The concept of a hard boundary was entirely foreign to his neurological wiring. "You cannot be serious!" David shouted, his artificial paternal pride instantly vaporizing into stark, unfiltered rage. He stood up, slapping his hand against the table. "You are going to let your own brother go to federal prison out of spite! You vindictive, selfish little girl!" He made a business error. You are sitting on a maritime empire your grandfather handed you on a silver platter. You will transfer the funds to Brandon's legal team by the end of business today, or so help me God, I will ensure you never speak to anyone in this family again. I offered my father a cold, measured stare. Your threats carry zero currency here, David. You already legally removed me from this family. You codified my exclusion when you handed me that trust document in August. You traded your daughter for a white-collar criminal. You placed all your bets on a fraudulent horse, and the race is over. The federal government is collecting your debts. My father collapsed back into his chair, his chest heaving, his authority permanently extinguished. Patricia panicked. The realization that anger would not bend my will forced her into a frantic, chaotic state of negotiation. She lunged forward in her seat, leaning her upper body across the wide expanse of the marble table. Her eyes were wide, pleading, rimmed with smeared mascara. She reached her hand across the polished stone, her manicured fingers stretching outward, desperate to grab my forearm to establish a physical tether to drag me back into the emotional swamp of her control. "Nicole, baby, please!" Patricia cried, her voice cracking. "Do not do this! I carried you! I raised you! You have to listen to your mother!" I did not recoil. I did not flinch or shout. I simply reached out with calm, deliberate precision and slid my crystal glass of ice water exactly 1 inch to the left. Patricia's frantic, grasping fingers met the cold, wet surface of the glass instead of my skin. Her hand slipped off the condensation, her knuckles rapping awkwardly against the marble. She froze, staring at the glass, her arm awkwardly extended across the table. That micro gesture held more power than 1,000 screamed insults. It was a silent, impenetrable boundary. It communicated that she no longer possessed the right to touch me, to manipulate me, or to demand my compliance. The physical distance between us was only 1 inch, but it represented an unbridgeable canyon. "I am not your baby," I stated, my tone steady and glacial. "I am the woman you called a parasite. I am the woman you left to handle hospice care alone while you attended social luncheons. I am the woman you planned to discard." I looked around the room, making eye contact with each of them one final time. I delivered my verdict with the ruthless efficiency of a corporate executive terminating a disastrous contract. "You expected me to remain the quiet, invisible workhorse," I continued. "You assumed I would absorb your risks, clean up your messes, and accept whatever scraps of affection you deemed appropriate to toss my way. You weaponized the concept of family to enforce my subjugation. But family requires reciprocity. It requires mutual respect. You offered neither." I pointed a steady finger at my brother, who was currently burying his face in his hands, weeping uncontrollably. "Brandon is a felon because you enabled his delusions for 3 decades. You shielded him from consequence, and now the consequence has arrived wearing a federal badge. Paying his restitution would not save him. It would only delay his inevitable ruin, and it would drain the legacy my grandfather entrusted to me. I shifted my gaze back to my mother, who was pulling her trembling hand back to her lap, her pristine white suit looking like a tragic costume. I will not liquidate my grandfather's maritime development rights to fund your son's criminal defense. I will not share the port. I will not answer your phone calls. I am officially severing all ties with David Patricia and Brandon Nichols. You are a toxic variable in my supply chain, and I am permanently rerouting my life around you. The truth of my words settled over them a heavy, suffocating blanket of reality. They possessed zero leverage. They had no legal standing, no financial resources, and no emotional currency left to spend. They were bankrupt in every conceivable metric. I turned away from the wreckage of my biological family and looked at Mr. Lawson. The formidable estate attorney sat quietly at the head of the table, his hands folded neatly over the thick manila envelope. A faint, unmistakable glimmer of respect shone in his sharp eyes. He offered a single approving nod, silently confirming that Henry's cargo was secure in my hands. "Thank you for your time, counselor," I said. "I will be in touch tomorrow to finalize the transfer of the commercial deeds and coordinate the next steps for the logistical expansion." "It will be a privilege doing business with you, Ms. Nichols," Mr. Lawson replied, his tone laced with genuine professional courtesy. I picked up my plain leather tote bag from the floor, looping the strap over my shoulder. I did not look back at the table. I did not cast a final lingering glance at the weeping brother, the defeated father, or the shattered mother. I walked toward the heavy mahogany double doors with long, purposeful strides. My steel-toed boots echoed against the hardwood floor, a steady, rhythmic march toward an uncharted horizon. I pushed the brass handles down. The doors swung open, revealing the bright, sunlit corridor of the high-rise law firm. I stepped out of the boardroom and let the heavy doors pull shut behind me. The solid click of the latch echoed in the hallway, severing the connection entirely. The muffled sounds of Brandon's panicked sobbing and Patricia's frantic wailing faded into the background, trapped inside the soundproof glass walls of their own ruin. I walked toward the express elevator, feeling a profound, intoxicating sense of liberation coursing through my veins. The air in the corridor smelled of expensive polish and fresh possibility. I pressed the call button, watching the digital numbers count down as the car ascended to my floor. I had survived the gauntlet. I had defended the perimeter, set the ultimate boundary, and walked away with my dignity, my wealth, and my total legal protection intact. The past was officially sealed away. Now I just had to decide what kind of empire I was going to build on the Georgia coast. Exactly 365 days have passed since I walked out of that Atlanta boardroom. Time is a peculiar metric. In the shipping industry, a year is measured in fiscal quarters, tonnage reports, and quarterly profit margins. In personal terms, a year is the exact amount of time required to detoxify your blood, rebuild your foundation, and erect an empire on the ashes of your past. I am standing on the top floor of a newly constructed glass and steel corporate headquarters overlooking the port of Savannah. The early morning sun breaks over the horizon, painting the coastal marshlands in brilliant streaks of amber and bruised violet. Down below, the shipping channel is alive with motion. Towering cranes pivot on their colossal tracks. Cargo freighters the size of small cities navigate the deep water corridors. Every single vessel entering this specific terminal pays a docking premium to Vanguard Maritime Solutions. That is the logistics firm I founded 10 months ago. I utilized the grandfather development rights Henry left me to negotiate an exclusive leasing agreement with 3 global shipping conglomerates. I did not sell the land. I retained the deed and leased the maritime access. The revenue generated in the first 3 quarters surpassed the initial $42 million valuation. I hired a team of elite supply chain analysts, built a board of directors, and secured my position as Chief Executive Officer. I no longer track delayed shipments from a cramped cubicle. I dictate the regional flow of international commerce. The warm golden sunrise over the Georgia marshlands spills through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office. The light stretches across my sprawling executive desk, illuminating a single-framed photograph resting near my computer monitor. It is a picture of Grandpa Henry, standing on his mountain porch holding his late wife's silver pocket watch, smiling with a quiet, knowing glint in his eye. I touch the wooden frame every morning before I review the daily freight manifests. It grounds me. It reminds me that true wealth is forged in loyalty, not entitlement. I have not spoken to David Patricia or Brandon Nichols since the heavy double doors of the law firm clicked shut behind me. I maintained the boundary with surgical precision. I blocked their phone numbers, instructed my corporate security team to turn them away from my building, and routed any legal correspondence directly to Mr. Lawson. However, keeping my distance did not prevent the local news from broadcasting the inevitable fallout. Brandon did not escape his federal indictment. Without the coastal deeds to use as fraudulent collateral, his shadow lender vanished. The authorities raided his real estate startup a week after the will reading. They seized his servers, froze his bank accounts, and dismantled his operation. He pleaded guilty to wire fraud to avoid a lengthy trial. He is currently serving a 50-month sentence in a minimum security federal correctional facility. His designer suits were traded for a standard-issue uniform. Amanda filed for divorce the moment the federal agents knocked on their front door. She attempted to spin the scandal into a viral victim narrative on her social media platforms, posting tearful videos claiming she was manipulated by a white-collar criminal. The internet is a ruthless judge. Her followers uncovered receipts showing her lavish spending sprees during the exact weeks the investor capital went missing. Her brand imploded overnight. She lost her sponsorships, sold her jewelry to pay her legal fees, and faded into digital obscurity. The reality of my parents' situation is perhaps the most tragic yet fitting conclusion of all. David and Patricia were forced to sell their pristine suburban home. The legal bills associated with Brandon's initial defense drained their remaining liquid assets. They downsized to a modest, cramped townhome on the outskirts of the city. Their social circle, the very people they performed for at Henry's funeral, abandoned them the moment the fraud scandal hit the front pages of the newspaper. Society forgives many things, but it rarely forgives the public humiliation of a high-profile financial crime. My parents live in quiet, socially isolated shame. They lost their golden child, their reputation, and their comfortable retirement. They also lost the only daughter who would have gladly cared for them in their old age, had they only treated her with a fraction of the respect they showered upon their son. They gambled their entire legacy on an illusion, and the house collected the debt. Before I close this chapter, I want to talk to you directly. If you are watching this, and you are currently trapped in a toxic family dynamic, I need you to understand a fundamental truth. Society conditions us to believe that blood requires infinite forgiveness. We are told to keep the peace, to absorb the disrespect, and to sacrifice our own potential to keep the family unit intact. We are labeled selfish the moment we demand basic human decency. Do not believe the lie. People ask me if I feel vindicated by my brother's prison sentence or my parents' social ruin. They assume my current success is a form of elaborate revenge. It is not. Revenge implies that my focus remains tethered to the people who hurt me. Revenge suggests that my actions are dictated by a desire to inflict pain. What I did was not revenge. It was self-preservation. setting a boundary is the ultimate victory. It is not about destroying toxic people. Toxic people will eventually destroy themselves without any assistance. True victory is removing their access to you. It is reclaiming your energy, your resources, and your peace of mind. You do not need to scream plot or retaliate. You simply need to stand up, slide the glass of water out of their reach, and walk out of the room. You build an empire on the foundation of your own truth, and you let them suffocate in the ruins of their deceit. If my story resonated with you, if you have ever had to walk away from the people who were supposed to protect you, please subscribe to this channel. Share your own journey in the comments. We find our strength in knowing we are not alone. You have the power to rewrite your own legacy. Never let anyone convince you that you are just a supporting character in their false narrative. The work week ends on Friday afternoon. I leave the towering glass headquarters, delegating the weekend logistics to my senior vice president. I drive my sedan, the same reliable vehicle I owned a year ago, out of the suffocating coastal heat and head north toward the misty elevation of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I did not sell Henry's cabin. I spent the last few months quietly renovating the interior, preserving the rustic charm while updating the foundation. It serves as my sanctuary, a quiet retreat from the relentless pace of global commerce. I arrive just as the evening shadows stretch across the dense pine forest. The air up here is crisp, clean, and entirely untainted by the heavy expectations of the past. I brew a pot of dark roast coffee in the small kitchen, the familiar scent of bitter beans and old timber filling the space. I step out onto the wooden wraparound porch. I hold the warm ceramic mug in both hands, taking a slow, deep breath. The only sound is the wind rustling through the towering pines and the distant rhythmic call of a lone owl. There is no ringing telephone. There are no frantic demands for unearned capital. There are no cruel insults disguised as practical decisions. There is only peace. I sit down in Henry's old rocking chair. The wood groans slightly beneath my weight, a comforting, familiar sound. I look out over the sprawling forested valley, watching the final rays of sunlight dip below the mountain ridge. I survived the storm. I protected the cargo. I built the empire. I take a sip of the hot coffee, smiling into the quiet twilight. Finally and unequivocally free. The gavel strikes, the reading concludes, and an empire changes hands. When we look back at the wreckage of the Nichols family, the true tragedy is not a $42 million loss, nor the spectacular collapse of a favored son's fraudulent facade. The most profound tragedy lies in a quiet sunroom on a stifling August afternoon, where two parents looked at their loyal, hard-working daughter and decided she was entirely expendable. Nicole's journey from an overlooked logistics manager to the sole heir of a maritime monopoly is a thrilling tale of justice. But beneath the surface of this corporate triumph beats the bruised heart of a deeper reality. It is a mirror held up to the foundation of American parenting, family responsibility, and the misguided ways we attempt to build a legacy. In traditional American culture, we place immense value on the family unit. We cultivate pristine suburban lawns, pose for coordinated holiday portraits, and structure our lives around the promise of generational stability. The American dream itself is intrinsically tied to the idea of providing a better, easier life for the next generation. Yet, as David and Patricia demonstrated, this traditional structure can easily rot from the inside out if it is not reinforced by honesty, fairness, and deep emotional awareness. The parents in this story believed they were providing long-term guidance. They convinced themselves that disinheriting their daughter to keep things simple was a practical business decision. In reality, it was a gross abdication of parental responsibility. They confused financial enabling with love, and in doing so, engineered their family's destruction. When we raise children, our primary duty is not to pave a frictionless road for them, but to equip them with the resilience required to navigate a world full of obstacles. By constantly bailing out Brandon, absorbing his debts, shielding him from lawsuits, and ultimately offering up his sister's inheritance to fund his delusions, David and Patricia crippled their son. They created a golden child who was structurally hollow, entirely dependent on external validation and unearned capital. He learned that accountability was something you could buy your way out of, provided you had the right parents. Conversely, by neglecting Nicole, they taught their daughter that her worth was strictly conditional. Fairness in parenting does not necessarily mean absolute mathematical equality in all things, but it absolutely requires equitable emotional investment. It demands that a parent looks at their children clearly, acknowledging their individual strengths, weaknesses, and intrinsic value. Emotional awareness means recognizing when your child is drowning, but it also means recognizing when your child needs to learn how to swim. David and Patricia lacked the emotional courage to let Brandon face the consequences of his actions. They lacked the honesty to admit that their son was failing. Instead of offering genuine long-term guidance, they opted for the comfort of a curated illusion. They sacrificed the child who actually embodied their purported values to prop up the child who only possessed the aesthetics of success. Grandpa Henry stands in stark contrast to this failure. He represents the ultimate figure of traditional family responsibility. He possessed the profound emotional awareness required to look past the holiday dinner smiles and see the toxic rot eating away at his lineage. Henry understood that true legacy is not about keeping the peace. It is about protecting the truth. By legally disinheriting the abusers and empowering the scapegoat, Henry provided the ultimate lesson in accountability. He used his wealth not to enable dysfunction, but to amputate it. He recognized that leaving his fortune to his son would only perpetuate a cycle of deceit. In an era where families often prioritize keeping up appearances over addressing harsh realities, Henry's final act was a masterclass in brutal, necessary honesty. If we are to take anything from Nicole's story, it must be an unyielding commitment to raising children with a foundation built on truth rather than convenience. We must foster emotional awareness in our homes, teaching our children that their value is inherent rather than conditional upon their obedience or their ability to uphold a fragile social facade. We must embrace the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is to step back and let a child fail. Only in the crucible of consequence can genuine character be forged. These are the kinds of stories that challenge us to look inward, to examine the quiet resentments and unspoken dynamics operating within our own living rooms. If you find value in these reflections, if you want to continue exploring the hidden depths of family dynamics, societal expectations, and the triumphs of those who finally break free, please take a moment to subscribe and follow Zara Told Stories. We are dedicated to bringing you narratives that force us to question the very fabric of our relationships. As we consider the quiet, sprawling peace Nicole finally found on the porch of her grandfather's mountain cabin, we are left to grapple with the haunting echoes of her parents' failure. We are conditioned to believe that the ultimate goal of parenting is to build a legacy to pass down to our children, ensuring their comfort and securing our own immortality. We view family as an unbreakable chain, bound by an unpayable debt of gratitude from child to parent. But perhaps that conventional wisdom is the greatest lie we tell ourselves. Perhaps the truth is that we do not build legacies for our children at all. We build children for our legacies, and if we build them poorly, they will burn our empires to the ground. Family is not a mandatory life sentence. It is a daily audition. You do not own your children's futures simply because you authored their pasts. The most terrifying and beautiful reality of parenthood is that your children will eventually become the judges of your character. When the final ledger is balanced, you will not be remembered for the wealth you tried to leave behind, but for the respect you are willing to give. We assume the parents are the permanent architects of the family, but in the end, it is the forgotten children who decide what remains in the ruins.